Welcome once again, fight fans, to another episode of Career Profiles brought to you in association with BTR Boxing Podcast. Today's episode has been picked by you, the listeners and the users on the Twitter profile at career_profiles. You voted for Sugar Ray Robinson as part of the 100 Club, which included many fantastic fighters from yesteryear, and this is one that me and Johnson have really been looking forward to. He's one of the greatest fighters of all time, if not the greatest fighter of all time in some people's minds, and we're really excited to break down this career profile. But before we do that, please go and check us out on social media at career_profiles on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook. Now, if you've not already subscribed to the Career Profiles podcast, you can do so by checking us out on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, TuneIn, Player FM, wherever you get your podcasts. Just give us a search, Career Profiles, we're there. Subscribe and get all the latest episodes of the series. So, let's go into this particular episode then, as voted for by you, the listeners and users of Twitter and Facebook. This is the Career Profile of Sugar Ray Robinson.
One of the newspaper men remarked to George Gainford, my manager, that I was a sweet fighter. And George replied, sweet as sugar. And since that time, Sugar Ray Robinson has been added.
Never knew in the kid. Never knew of.
So this is the career profile of Sugar Ray Robinson, one of the greatest fighters to ever lace them up and get in the squared circle, and one that is probably going to be by far the longest career profile podcast episode we've done, just due to the fact that he did so many things in his career and in his life, and he had such a significant career that we really wanted to deep dive into it and find out more information about what this guy was really like and what his career and his life was really like. So as always, we're going to go through this in a chronological fashion. We're going to talk about his early life before he got into boxing, if he had an amateur career, what it was like, and of course his professional career. So he is referred to as the greatest of all time by a lot of people, although Muhammad Ali tops that list for most people. Sugar Ray Robinson, for me, is one of the greatest pound for pound all time.
He is for me too. Sugar Ray Robinson was, they created the pound for pound list that everyone throws around today when they put their little list together. You know, that was generated literally because of Sugar Ray Robinson, and because, you know, they wanted to do something to show people just how great he was. And because he did move through a couple of weights, mainly a couple of weights, today it would have been 4 weights, actually we moved on to light heavyweight. So it was important that they tried to show that Sugar Ray Robinson was the greatest. And honestly, anyone in the world that loves boxing will always have Sugar Ray Robinson as their number one. I don't think you read anyone throwing a name about as their greatest ever fighter, I'll guarantee you Sugar Ray Robinson will probably come out at number one on many of them, and rightly so, because he is an absolute class act.
He certainly is. So we're going to go into the life of Sugar Ray Robinson, or how he was born as, which was Walker Smith Jr., and he was born on the 3rd of May 1921 in LA, Georgia. So, Sugar Ray Robinson then, let's talk about his life. Let's talk about where it all began for him. So, his family set up home in a place called Black Bottom in Detroit. Now, Black Bottom was, as the name suggests, it was the sink area of a rapidly growing industrial city. Now, Black Bottom is often erroneously believed to be a reference to the African American community that developed in the 20th century. And now the neighbourhood was actually named by an early French colonial settlers for the dark, fertile topsoil that was actually found in the area, which was known as river bottomlands. Now, Sugar Ray, or Walker Smith Jr., said he's actually called Black because we lived there, and Bottom because that's where we were at. So people referred to that area as Black Bottom, not because it was named by the French colonials. It was named that way because it was an African American community living there who were really struggling to make a living for themselves.
Yeah, and great line there from Ray. That was probably how many felt when they lived there. And obviously, Walker Smith was his dad, Walker Smith Senior. He was the guy. He worked hard, Walker Smith. I'm going to call him Senior because when Walker Smith Jr., as in Sugar Ray Robinson, was born. It was his firstborn, and he said that his name will be Walker Smith Jr., and we will refer to him as Junior. So if we do mention the name Junior, we are referring to Sugar Ray, but Junior was what he was called pretty much until we started boxing. So Walker Smith Sr., he played hard, but he was a bit of a sharp dresser, but he did like a drink or three as well. So Layla Smith, who was Junior's mum, Layla Smith she wasn't your normal wife. She was a little bit beyond her time, really, because she was quite stringent. She knew what she wanted, and she wasn't going to take no shit, basically. So that she would argue with Senior a lot about him spending the money and sort of spending his money on drink, which I'm sure many families had that same situation, and many women would have stayed by their man. But as I say, Layla Smith, she wasn't that way inclined, and Layla decided that she had enough. So one day she took Junior and his two sisters back to her mother's farm in Georgia, where they were living previously. She left the children there before returning back to Detroit, and then so they lived on the farm for a year, basically. That's what Ray did with his two sisters. And then after a year, she returned. She returned to come and collect them. And when she did, she headed back up to the city to do a job, which I believe she was earning $10 a day, or maybe $10 a week. I'm not quite sure. It wasn't a lot. And she had the plan of divorcing Walker Senior. So, you know, as I say, it was unusual for a woman to be so, you know, to stand up for herself. And she was very straight-minded. She knew exactly what she wanted. So she picked the kids up. She got herself a job, and she did. She divorced Senior. And that was where they lived. They lived in Black Bottom for a little while. Junior was 7 years old. He wasn't too best pleased with the situation because he was quite happy on the farm with his grandparents. But, you know, she scooped up the clan, and she decided that they're going to head to North in Black Bottom, and that was where they resided.
To keep him out of trouble, Junior's mum, Layla, who we've referred to, would give him a quarter to go to the local brand new gym, which was named the Brewster Centre. Now, that brand new gym was where Junior began to learn his trade. So, young Walker had a favourite that he looked up to, and his name was Joe Barrow. And he would follow Joe around all the time, and sometimes Junior would be allowed to carry his gym bag, which made him feel about 10 feet tall. Now, if you don't know who Joe Barrow was Joe Louis. So for any historians out there, you will know that it was Joe Louis, but Joe Barrow was his original name. So he was looking at a guy who was embarking on a great career himself, so it was a big thing for him. Now, other notable names that would become associated with this particular gym, the Brewster Centre, were Eddie Futch, Joe Frazier, and the late, great Emmanuel Stewart. Now, in 1932, Junior's mum decided to move the family to Manhattan in New York, and that was 49 West 53rd Street to be exact. Now, this was to get better opportunities. This was to create a better life for these kids. Now, it was at this point that Junior was given money from his mum for dancing lessons, which would prove to be an invaluable experience. And, of course, it would also be where he benefited in learning the art of footwork from.
So, of course, he took the money from his mum, and he did a bit of dancing when he was. It was something he did do, he did enjoy. But his greater love, the one love he liked more than anything, was boxing. So what he started to do was he took the money from the dancing lessons, and he used it to pay for fees to fight at the Police Athletic League. He took part in these tournaments, which were actually arranged by a gentleman that goes by the name of Benny Bootsinger. Now, Benny was a little guy that heard about Junior fighting on the street because, you know, living it was a difficult area. It was hard. So he had a few scraps. So he actually heard about Junior Ray fighting on the street. So he actually asked him if he would come along to one of his amateur bills. Now, Junior ended up bashing up a kid called Harmon. And this was over 3 rounds. Now, he was actually ready to fight his big brother when his mum found out that he was fighting. So his mum come into the gym. She stepped in, she stopped the fight, and she chased him all the way home. And then after that, she actually chased Benny off the street as well. So again, you know, just referring to Layla, she didn't take no shit, and she weren't happy with her son using the money that she was giving him for dancing lessons to go boxing. So, but you know, with that being said, it wasn't enough to keep Benny away from what he had witnessed from young Walker Jr., Sugar Ray. He obviously see there was a talent there. So he continued to put Ray on his cards around the city, and he continued to learn the trade well, and he was doing really well. Now, it was during this time that Layla decided to then move the family who were actually living in the lower side of Manhattan. So basically, if you think of Central Park, it was literally the south of Central Park. And then she moved him up to Harlem, which was the north of Central Park, where she sent him off to school.
So while he was at school, a pupil and a friend named Warren Jones, who was also an amateur boxer, he actually told Junior about a local gym that his uncle ran. It was called the Salem Crescent Gym, which was in the basement of a Salem Methodist church. Now, Layla, obviously supporting his son, was thrilled with the idea of Junior being watched over by an authoritative figure. Obviously, his father not really being in his life at this point, and he was being taught discipline. But there was one condition, and that was Junior does not fight under no circumstances. Now, George Gainford was one of those figures that watched over Junior, and also the uncle of his friend Warren Jones. Now, it didn't take long before Big George realised that he had a talent on his hands, and with his nurture, he could turn him into something special. That authoritative figure, the discipline, the dedication, he believed that he could turn Walker Smith Jr. into something special. Now, George rustled up $25, which back then was a lot of money, probably talking about £100 UK, probably about $150 maybe in the US. And he told Junior that, let's go and get some boxing equipment with that money. So he sent him off to get some boxing equipment, and Junior goes out. Now, once George realised that Junior had failed to return with this boxing equipment and worked out that he'd actually done a runner with this money, George was really put out by it. He was really disappointed in Junior by this. So what does he go and decide to do? Go and decide to hunt Junior down. Now, when he found him, he actually brought him back to the gym, and as a punishment, he made him train in only his underwear for the next few days before going out there and actually buying that boxing equipment for himself. So there you go. That's karma coming back to haunt you. And that was the way of teaching people a lesson. And there's ways and means of doing that. And that was George Gainford's way of doing it, which was to hunt him down. Rather than giving him a belt, which a lot of people would have done back then, he made him train in the boxing gym with all of his other friends and all of the other boxers in that gym in his underwear. So which must have been really humbling and embarrassing for him.
Yeah. And the other thing as well is obviously George must have seen something in him as well, because if he was a guy that didn't show much talent, and I'm sure he probably would have, as you say, probably would have given the belt and took his $25 back, but obviously you see something in Junior and he decided to teach him a lesson, and rightly so. I mean, nothing better than humiliating someone in front of their pals, because I'm sure they will sort of knock them back in line, and that's exactly what happened. And in the Salem Crescent Gym, they would travel around the city, around New York City, pretty much between sort of, whether it be Harlem or the Bronx or wherever it may be, and they were fighting other in fighting tournaments against sort of other gyms basically. And Junior, obviously, with George being a Layla that he can't fight under no uncertain terms, so he would tag along and he would only watch. And there would be several nights when they would come back from a fight, and Ray would have been watching his friends, and he would say to George, I could have beaten this fella. And George used to say, yeah, I know you could have. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. So from this point, it was one night in Kingston, New York, and an AAU organiser asked Gainford if he had a flyweight. Now, initially, George said no, he didn't have one. So he sent him on his way. And then Junior, who was desperate to fight, he really wanted to fight. He had seen, obviously, his mates fighting. He was dying to fight. I know his mum said he couldn't, but, it was something he wanted to do. So he pushed George, and he sort of said to him, look, I'll flyweight. I can do it for you. So in the end, George calls back this organiser and he says, look, I've got a flyweight for you. So the one thing was, because it was young Junior, he didn't have a card. He wasn't registered. So, but one thing that George did have was he had a little stash. He had a little stash of cards of other fighters that had been in his gym and left. So George flicked through a handful of cards that he had on emergency, for emergencies like this, and Bob's your uncle, up pops Ray Robinson. And that's when he says to the AA organiser, got a flyweight for you, and his name is Ray Robinson.
Ray Robinson happened to be a very good friend of mine, and I borrowed his license birth certificate to obtain a boxing license back in 1938-39. He was a couple of years older, and I needed to be a little older to have a boxing license. And one night, while boxing in Watertown, New York, upon one of my first early KOs, upon leaving the ring, one of the newspaper men remarked to George Gainford, my manager, that I was a sweet fighter, and George replied, "Sweet as sugar."
So it's funny that this is how the story of his name going to Ray Robinson happened, by a card which belongs to probably a former boxer of that particular gym, which is it's a great story, really, because I it's something I didn't really know about when looking back on the career of him until we've deep dived into the story behind it all. So Gainford then introduced Junior as Ray Robinson, and he actually fought his first amateur bout and won by a unanimous decision. Now, Junior knew the real Ray Robinson, and he would tease him that he'd stole his name. The last time the new Ray Robinson saw him, he was working as a bartender. So there you go. Now, obviously, our Ray Robinson was fighting on all the bootleg circuits. Now, these were bouts where they were supposed to be amateurs. Now, the boxer would get a watch, which he would then sell before competing in the bout, and then he would end up going back and buying it off the boxer again.
And the guy would buy it back from him at the end of the fight. So they'd give him, every guy that goes there, give him a watch. And then the guy would basically, after the fight, he would get a watch back from him. And then the winner would give $10 and the loser would give $8. That was how they worked it. That was why it was illegal, apparently. That's what I read.
So it's crazy to think that obviously this was how they did it. It was just basically swapping watches and money over to basically do these unauthorized, or what some might say in this day and age, was like white collar style, competitive fights, because they weren't essentially sanctioned. So going back to the story of this, then George Gainford said that Ray didn't lose. I made a living with them fights during the Depression. So George Gainford knew that he had a pot of gold on his hands, and it was Ray Robinson, and he was the one that was bringing all this money over to them and winning all these fights. So in 1938, Ray beat an undefeated flyweight champion of Connecticut who went by the name of Willie Papaleo. Now, in later years, he would actually go on to be known as Willie Pep. The great Willie Pep, this is, by the way. It was because of that victory that Ray and George ended up getting nicked by a Hartford policeman, claiming that no amateur could be Willie Pep, so he must be a pro. Now, they were later released once an AAU boxing man in New York vouched for them. It's, again, another crazy story that he ended up getting nicked for something essentially that seemed a bit strange, really. A bit of a strange story, that one, that happened. And obviously, they end up going on to get someone in New York that vouched for them because of the fact that they'd been on the circuit for so long.
I mean, Willie Pep at the time, obviously undefeated, and they obviously felt that with him being such a good amateur, undefeated, there's no pro that could ever beat Willie Pep, and it was actually a policeman and a representative from the AAU boxing club as well, funny enough, or the white collar boxing club, that they were like, no, we're not having this. We need to get your records, you need to get your papers. And for that reason, we're going to go and send you to sit in a cell for a little while. And I don't think, George, from what I read, wasn't too best pleased with it. He obviously hollering and shouting about the fact that, hold on a minute, kind of thing, but he ain't going to get nowhere. He was falling on deaf ears. And thankfully, someone did vouch for him and they were released. So I'm not quite sure how old Ray was. I'm guessing 1938, so he was only in his teens, bless him. So he must have been a bit shell-shocked by the whole thing. He's just beating Willie Pep, like, that's it. So in February 1938, it was Young Walker's second amateur loss, which actually happened in the Golden Gloves tournament. So in 1938, he went to the Golden Gloves tournament and he actually lost. And that's something many people miss out, they don't realise, but he actually lost to a guy called Patsy Pesca. And the only other amateur loss on his record was to a guy called Billy Graham, an Irish fella. So the only two losses there are actually on Junior Walker. So that always goes down. So when you look at Ray Robinson's record, normally, very rarely you see he's got those two losses because obviously he fought under a different name. He actually also fought with someone else. So I think it was Ray Ray Rocky or something, Ray something else. It was never always Ray Robinson either. So looking through the archives, obviously they discovered that he was undefeated as Ray Robinson.
Going back to his life then outside of the ring, the talented teenager at this point, 17 years old, and he married a lady by the name of Ragery Joseph after finding out he'd got her pregnant. So back in them days, of course, you weren't supposed to have a baby out of wedlock, and it was frowned upon. People spoke about it. It wasn't a nice thing to do back then. Obviously, culture and society has completely changed, but at that period of time, as a result of getting her pregnant, he has to get married to her. So, following an argument about money with his new wife, his mum overheard it, and when his mum, Layla, intervened, she found out he was boxing. So, he'd been keeping the secret that he was actually boxing, not just training, but he'd been competing. Now, this was something that you would have expected to go down in quite a negative way, but actually it was quite positive because all turned out to be pretty sweet when she found out that Ray had a grand stashed away in Majory's shoes. So all that money he'd been accumulating from all them fights he'd been winning, and he weren't getting beat off anybody, and he was doing the watches and the $8 and the $10. When his mum found out he actually had quite a lot of money stashed away, all them issues about him boxing quickly went away.
Like it does when people see the loot.
Now, the night of January the 5th, 1939, would be very significant for Ray Robinson. Now, he was leading the Salem Crescent team into battle in a little town of Watertown in upstate New York. Now, Ray's opponent was a tough brawler named Don Perfetti, an Eastern States champion. Now, in a scheduled 5-round bout, Robinson used his speed and he outboxed and outpunched the bantamweight. Watching from the press row was an impressed sports editor of the Watertown Times by the name of Jack Case, who told George Gansford, "This is a sweet fighter you've got here, a real sweet fighter." Now, the stories are actually quite varied, but it was either a female spectator who overheard Case or Gainford himself that replied, "Sweet as sugar." Now, one thing is for certain, the next morning, Case printed a name, Sugar Ray Robinson, and from that moment on, a legend was born.
Yeah, how impressive is that? I mean, I think Sugar Ray himself says that it's George Gainford, but then you do read in some books, as well as I believe Wikipedia, say it was a woman that overheard and said as sweet as sugar. But either way, I think Sugar Ray Robinson, it rolled off the tongue. It was just it's a great name, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't get any better than that as a made-up name, and the way obviously young Walker Smith Jr. come from Black Bottom, Detroit, had reinvented himself, and that name would be forever stitched into the fabric of the boxing history. And as I say, it just rolls off your tongue, doesn't it? And whoever knew that Jack Case was going to be the guy that he basically created the Sugar Ray Robinson style. So an interesting fact for you all, something I didn't know. I never knew it was an editor that had actually put it out on a newspaper print, and basically Sugar Ray liked it and he stuck with it. So Sugar Ray had become the talk of the city, and he had racked up several knockouts en route to the 1939 Golden Gloves featherweight final. So, you know, in 1938, he obviously had that disappointing defeat. I believe it was like the semi-finals, wasn't even the final. So in 1939, in the Golden Gloves featherweight final, and the papers were actually calling him Death Ray Robinson because he was literally knocking them all out. So he actually ended up fighting his stablemate at the time, a good friend of his called Spider Valentine, and he ended up defeating Spider Valentine on points. He actually knocked him down in the opening round. And the funny story is that when he knocked him down, he actually, because he was a friend, he actually went over while the ref was counting to pick him up off the canvas because, you know, he didn't want to knock his mate down. And in the end, he got up, and then the fight obviously continued. And when he went back to his corner, it wasn't actually George in his corner, it was another guy from the gym. And he said to him, "Next time you knock him down, Ray, you make sure that it's the ref picking him up and not you." So quite funny. It just shows you how sort of naive he was as a young man. But he did win the 1939 Golden Gloves heavyweight title. So a great little start for him in terms of considering he only really started boxing, 3 years ago, and he's just gone and won the Golden Gloves. And people were raving about him. They couldn't believe just how good this kid was.
And 1939 was a really busy year for him because not only did he win the Golden Gloves championships, he also went on to win the Tournament of Champions against Jimmy Butler, the Intercity title beating Tony Ancona, and the Daily News title defeating Andy Nonella. Now, following the birth of his son, Ronnie Smith Robinson, he ended up having his marriage with Major Annold. So that's just a situation where I think it's happened to so many people before him and so many people after him. He's got involved in a relationship. He's got a little bit too trigger happy, ended up getting her pregnant, not realising that she was the one for him. And it's obviously conspired down the line that they were obviously too young and they weren't meant to be together. So they ended up getting the marriage annulled as a result of that. So we move forward to the next year. And in 1940, Ray Robinson won his second Golden Gloves at the lightweight category now, before turning over to the professional ranks at just 19 years old, with George Ganford as his main trainer and the local tycoon named Carl Horman as his manager. Now, this was under the name of Sugar Ray Robinson, and the tutelage of Ganford, he ended his amateur career with a record of 85-0, with 69 knockouts and 40 of those coming in the first round. So going back to what you were saying earlier then, about the defeats that he had were under a different name that was registered. I wonder if anything has ever come of that. I mean, nobody really speaks about that. Everybody speaks about Sugar Ray Robinson as Sugar Ray Robinson, as opposed to his original name, which is obviously Walker Smith Jr. So technically then, although he's undefeated as Sugar Ray Robinson in the amateur side of his career, he did take them losses that you spoke about, which is something I don't know if a lot of people knew that, because I certainly didn't. I knew that he was undefeated as an amateur fighter as Sugar Ray Robinson, but I never knew the stories before doing this podcast of him having different names as an amateur, only for brief periods of time. But the fact that he did have them names, people don't really speak about that. These are facts that, again, are quite difficult to find, because when you think of Sugar Ray Robinson, you think of all the marquee fights, which we're going to cover off in the episode. But yeah, it's a really interesting story and a really interesting way to end his amateur career. Technically on record as Sugar Ray Robinson, going undefeated, but now you all know, if you didn't know already, that actually he did get defeated in the amateurs.
Yeah, no, and it was in a book called The Comeback King, where they did mention the two defeats and actually named them. Whereas on Wikipedia, it does have Robinson down as an 85-2 as an amateur, with 69 of those victories coming by way of knockout, 40 in the first round. But they never named those two. They don't even really mention those two names. So it was interesting to find it, because as you say, many people always just assume that Ray was undefeated as an amateur. And I mean, to be fair, he was defeated as Sugar Ray Robinson, that's for sure. But, you know, a couple of defeats, 85 fights or whatever, how many fights he had, you know, he had a couple of defeats. So I'm sure they were close, that's for sure. Yeah, so that was it, 85-0 or 85-2, however you want to call it. But, you know, 69 knockouts as well, 40 of those coming in the first round. I don't think we'd ever see a record like that ever again. So Ray's professional debut came at the Mecca of boxing, which was obviously Madison Square Garden at the time. And he fought a guy called Joe Echeverria. Now, I know he was a Puerto Rican. He was a blowout. He knocked him out in 2 rounds. Carl and George actually allowed Ray to keep the entire purse, which was $150. Now, I'm sure they knew that he was going to make a hell of a lot more money after, so it probably made sense to let him keep the whole purse and keep him sweet.
We're going to the end of 1940 then, and he had 6 fights in 1940, won all of them, and 5 of them by way of knockout. So we move forward to 1941. Now, obviously we're fast forwarding in through his career, because we've got to remember this guy had a hell of a lot of fights, so we're not going to cover all of them off, but we are going to talk about significant moments, of course, in his career. Now, he gets to 21-0, and if Ray Robinson goes on to fight the current world lightweight champion by the name of Sammy Agnot, who was 15-5 in there, and this was their first encounter, by the way. Now, unfortunately, at the time, Agnot's title was not on the line, and Ray Robinson did actually go on in that particular fight to win by a 10-round decision, and this happened at Shoe Park in Philadelphia. Now, Agnott was down for a 9 count in the second round, and he barely beat the count. All the eyewitness accounts and reports on that say that he barely beat the account. Now, Agnott, he could never launch a sustained offence against the dancing long-armed Robinson, who hit him with darting jabs, whistling left hooks, and booming bolo punches rights that came up from the floor to sink into Sammy's stomach. And this victory propelled Robinson into the big time money-wise. His purse was $600, which, again, translating that over to money in 2020, you're probably looking at triple the amount. So, as a result of that, with that money, he moved his mum into a new apartment, furnished it, and bought his first car, which was a new black convertible. And after this, his mum would never have to work again.
Yes, a brilliant story. He earns that cash, and unfortunately, he doesn't get the world title. He earns himself the money, I suppose, that would have come with it. But unfortunately, back in those days, you're talking about a young guy in Sugar Ray, 21-0. He's a black guy. He's very good. He's just not going to get a title shot. It's just awful. And then, considering just how good he was, and you know, we all still know him decades later as still be one of the best. So he probably would have picked up a lightweight title, only 20 fights in. Sod's law, that's just how it was, unfortunately. And you know, it was the same for many fighters. So Ray was 24-0 before he outpointed the then undefeated future welterweight champion, and his name was Marty Survey. Now, Marty Survey was 42-0-2 in Philadelphia. So beating a current lightweight world champion, and then just 3 fights later beating Marty Survey, then go on to win a welterweight world title, just shows you just how good he was at welterweight. It was impressive, really, and he really should have held a title at this point. So during the summer of 1941, Ray would cool down after training with a swim in the Lidle Pool, which was near Coogan's Bluff and the Polo Grounds. Both were based in Upper Manhattan, located in Coogan's Hollow near the western shore of the Harlem River. So it was here where he met his first love. It was Edna Mae Holly. Now, she was a dancer at the famous Cotton Club, and to get her attention, he actually pushed her in the pool. I believe it was a story in the documentary where he said, if she walks past me again, I'm going to push her in the pool, and it was his way of trying to pull her. So he was obsessed with her all summer, and he basically spent all summer trying to pull her. So by the time Ray actually relocated his training camp to the Greenwood Lake in preparation for the first fight with Fritzy Zivic, another tough guy, Fritzy Zivic as well, by the way, and a feared fighter, and no one really gave an opportunity to. You find him in many top fighters sort of in their resume, but Ganoff, he was an excellent fighter as well, tough geezer. And so by that point, they'd become an item. So yeah, he had himself a new missus as he prepared for Fritzy Zivic in 1941.
So that was his next fight that we'll move on to, and that happened on the 31st of October. Now, at this point, Sugar Ray Robinson had an uninterrupted run of 25 wins, with 20 of them by way of knockout or stoppage. Now, in front of a sellout crowd of 21,551 people at Madison Square Garden, Ray Robinson took a unanimous decision against the tough Zivic, who was 111, 26 and 6. God, they don't make him like that anymore. Anyway, put it that way.
Oh my God, it's crazy.
Now, Ray, of course, using his skills, fought a distance for pretty much the whole fight, but he did actually wobble Zivic, which was in the 9th round. Now, this was a guy, like we just said there, who'd had, over 140 fights in his career at the time Sugar Ray Robinson fought him, who had only had 25 fights, which seems nothing in comparison. But that just goes to show you the measure of the talent that he had to be able to get that victory over Zivic. So we go to the end of 1941 then, and in 1941, he had 20 fights, he won all 20, and 15 of them come by way of knockout.
Yes, so into 1942 now. So this was 2.5 months later in 1942 that Ray defeated Zivic again, this time by a knockout in the 10th of the scheduled 12. So following the Zivic fight, Ray decided he wanted to change the direction. As far as he was concerned, for his manager, basically, he found that Holman, his manager, he sort of felt that, I think it was an easy touch. I think there was something I read where he would agree a purse for a fight against an opponent, and Ray was never happy with the amount of money Ray always felt that there should be more money. He should be getting more money. And Mike, he never, Holman never really pushed it. And what he would actually do is he'd bump up the money himself. So he got rid of him. He decided he'd had enough. So at the age of 20 years old, what he did was he borrowed $10,000 from an influential promoter called Mike Jacobs, aka Uncle Mike, who famously coined the phrase, "What's in it for Mike?" And of course, he was the manager of Joe Louis, which is something you will find a lot. Joe Louis and Sugar Ray, as we said at the start of the show, with Ray looking up to Joe Louis very early on in his career, and he was the reigning ring and lineal heavyweight champion at the time. So with that money, he did buy out his relationship with Holman, and he decided, which was again a very shrewd thing to do, he decided to manage himself, and that's something you wouldn't do in 1942. A young black fighter, no matter how good you are, it's going to be difficult to get yourself those big fights, but he obviously felt that he was able to get them. So credit to Ray. It's a brave thing to do, and well, it worked for him. Let's put it that way.
So just to put into context what else was going on around this time in 1942 is that this is around about the time where the mob or mafia, they had a bit of a strong hold on the pro boxing game, and especially on the East Coast of America, and they were involved in several match-fixing scandals. And at the centre of this was a wealthy and powerful man who was influential in American sports, including racehorses, NHL, and boxing were the main three at this point. Now, he's also the president of the International Boxing Club, also known as the IBC. Now, this organisation was known as the organisation, and the name of this particular gentleman was Jim Norris. Now, Norris was basically affiliated with two of the most unsavoury characters in the underworld by the name of Blinky Polero, and the brains of the operation, a guy whose name you may have heard in other various podcasts that we do, and Mr. Frankie Caro, aka Mr. Grey. Now, these were associated with Murder Incorporated or Murder Inc. Now, before moving into boxing with the Philly mobster Polero, they pulled the strings with Norris and the IBC and bought the rights to stage fights at Madison Square Garden. So this is where it starts to get really tied in with the mafia's affiliation with boxing, because they're all working together to basically have MSG as a stronghold, as a place to put all their fights and fighters. And that wouldn't be the only place they would do it in, because once they got hold of MSG, Madison Square Garden, they ended up branching out to Chicago and to Detroit as well. So they basically pretty much orchestrated boxing in the East Coast and the Midwest.
Yeah, and that was a sign of the times. And, we did do the legendary nights with Joe Louis, and we mentioned very, very, very vaguely on sort of the corruptness of the boxing at the time. And that was the RBC. And the RBC, obviously, the MSG, Madison Square Garden, was the mecca of boxing at the time. So, you get that, you pretty much got all the top fighters, and they had them all. Now the thing was with Ray, managing himself, he was a tremendous fighter. Everybody knew it. He was the guy that was the champion that just didn't hold a title. Quite simply, everybody knew just how good he was. He was actually being touted as one of the best welterweights ever at this point, even now. This is crazy. So Ray was never actually affiliated with the mob at this point in his career. Now, he was approached by Mr. Grey. I believe it was a telephone call. I don't think he ever went and spoke with him in face-to-face, but he did contact Ray. And he basically said, along the lines of, he said, Ray, this is Mr. Grey, and I'm associated with the Bull. Now, the Bull, obviously, was Jake LaMotta. Now, he wasn't actually associated with Jake. He was associated with his brother, because Jake LaMotta's brother was sort of in and out of the mafia. So he would try and do deals even if he didn't have a fighter, because he knew he'd get the fighter, because he could just go and break their legs or whoever he needed, whatever legs he needed breaking, because that was the type of guy he was. So he said, how about when you fight the Bull, you win the first one and then you lose the second. And then what we'll do is the third fight can be anyone's. And Ray, managing himself, young lad, he had some balls of skill really, because many fighters would have buckled, but he said he wasn't interested, and he basically politely declined and saying that's just not the way he does business. And that was it. That was it. You never ever heard back from him for a long time anyway. So that's credit to Ray again, this young lad managing himself, his own fights, and he's even moving away from the mob. Because if he turns around and says to Mr. Gray, you know what, yeah, I'll take it, he could get a world title fight probably in his next fight. So, it's a brave thing to do.
It certainly was a brave thing to do. I mean, we've spoke about these particular characters in the Legendary Nights series. We've spoke about them in all different capacities of some of the podcasts that we've done. So you will hear these names come up very often in all the other podcasts for various reasons. And they're back here again on the career profile of Sugar Ray Robinson. So going back to the action then, going back to his career inside the ring, on October the 2nd, 1942, back at the Madison Square Garden, Ray fought the Bronx Bull, Jake LaMotta, for the first time. Now, this was the first of their 6 encounters. Jake LaMotta at the time was 25-4-2, and the winner was being touted for a possible world title shot. And again, just to put things into context, Ray's a welterweight at this point, and Jake LaMotta's a solid middleweight, and the competition's so sparse for both of them that it ended up meaning that Sugar Ray had to put weight on to be able to compete with Jake LaMotta. Because of that, he decided to take that step up and fight Jake LaMotta. So it was obviously a risky decision, but one that he felt like he needed to eventually get himself into a position to eventually become a world champion. So the difficulty for Ray was obviously no one wanted to fight him at this time during his welterweight reign or his campaign in the welterweight division because he's just so destructive. So because of that, like I said, he had to move up to the middleweight, and this was actually the first deal that he made on his own following the split with Horman. Now, as we've talked about, Jake LaMotta was a natural middleweight and he had a 10-pound weight advantage over Sugar Ray Robinson. But in that first fight, it didn't make a blind bit of difference because Ray's quick hand and his excellent footwork, which obviously came from them days of dancing, was just too much for LaMotta, and he took 7 out of the 10 rounds that it went in that particular fight. Now this, of course, as I've said, was just going to be the beginning of what would become a long-standing rivalry with fights that would thrill fight fans for decades.
Yeah, and it surely, I mean, who would have thought it that the first fight they would fight as many times as they end up doing, and it really does. We'll always be spoken about for decades and decades, and this is just the first one of them. So at the end of 1942, Sugar Ray was actually voted the Fighter of the Year by the Ring magazine, finishing the year with a career record at the time of 40-0 and 29 knockouts. He did actually have, in 1942, he had 14 fights for the year, winning them all, obviously. So he was in fine form, let's put it that way. But things were going to change, unfortunately, for Ray in 1943 because the USA were now at war. And the reigning welterweight champion at the time, who he was hoping to fight after defeating Jake LaMotta, was a gentleman by the name of Red Cochran. Now, he ended up in the Navy. So he went around to defend his title. So basically, Robinson had to wait for another 4 years before he got that title. So it's just crazy. It's just ironic. The war's obviously kicked off. So it was on the night of the 5th of February in his hometown of Detroit, and apparently out of shape. These are reports that I've read. He lost for the first time in his career. And obviously that was at the hands of a certain Jake LaMotta.
Yeah, so there's a little bit more to that particular story then. So this happened 4 months after they'd fought for the first time, and it was completely different because them stories of being out of shape could kind of coincide with how that fight went. According to ringside observers, LaMotta in this particular fight fought with a lot more tenacity and he cut off the ring, and no pun intended, he bowled his way on the inside. So he was using right hands to the body, left hooks to the head, and in the 8th round of that particular fight, Jake LaMotta put Sugar Ray Robinson down on the seat of his pants for the first time in his career, capturing one of the most iconic photographs of Sugar Ray Robinson in his career, and it's him being knocked out of the ring by Jake LaMotta.
Brilliant shot, isn't it? And obviously, it's his first defeat. Maybe they're looking for excuses. I don't know. I think that's probably discrediting Jake LaMotta a little bit, but a great performance from Jake. And obviously, Sugar Ray. Well, what can you say? Knocked down like that. One thing you will notice throughout Sugar Ray's career is that when he does get knocked down, he does get back up. In fact, he would never really stop. Let's be honest, in all those fights, it's incredible, to be fighting for so long. He had an iron chin, and that's one thing people don't really mention when they mention Sugar Ray Robinson, especially when you talk about fighting a Bronx Bull who was known to have a granite chin. But in actual fact, I think probably Ray had probably just as much of a tough chin. But either way, after that second fight, it was one each. And what Ray did, which was interesting, which you would never see today. So he ended up having a tune-up fight 2 weeks after the second Jake LaMotta fight against a guy called California Jackie Wilson. Now, Ray ended up fighting LaMotta for the third time a week after this fight. So within 3 weeks, he's fought California Jackie Wilson for a 10-round, won a decision, and then a week later goes and fights Jake LaMotta. I mean, that's just madness, isn't it? It's incredible. But Ray was put down again going into the first fight. Ray was put down again in the 7th round, but he did end up winning the fight quite convincingly, and he did outbox Jake LaMotta pretty much in all departments. Wasn't the clearest of victories of the 6, but it was definitely one of them. And again, I mean, one thing you all know with Sugar Ray, but you can't take him on in a rematch. If you beat him, what he had this great ability to be able to adjust, and he'd come back and do things differently and make sure he beats you the next time.
I think pound for pound, he was the greatest of everyone that stepped in the ring. Ray Robinson was the best fighter that ever stepped in the ring because he could punch, and even now when he used to back away from him, he could knock out with a left hook. I saw him knock out people with left hook. So generally, a fighter who backs away from someone can't hurt you. But Robinson, when he could hurt you backing away from you, somebody come in and tell you, I saw him at his best, and he was the best fighter that ever lived, pound for pound.
So the very next day, Sugar Ray Robinson was inducted into the United States Army. Remembering, obviously, the United States Army had joined the Second World War at this point, so it was a significant year outside of the ring. His wife Edna had reignited her show business career, remembering that she was a dancer from our earlier conversation. Now, this was at Joe Louis's new club, which was in Chicago, and this all happened while Ray was on duty. And there's a rumour that going around on the internet, and you can look this up and you can read in the books as well, that he was so pissed off that she'd reignited this dancing career that he decided to go AWOL, absent without leave, from the army. And he insisted that they get married. He brought her back to New York to get married on May the 29th of 1943. Going back to his tenure in the United States Army, during his 15-month military career, Robinson was referred to again as Walker Smith Jr. He actually served with the great Joe Louis as well, and the pair went on tours where they performed exhibition bouts in front of the US Army troops. Now, it's funny because Robinson got into trouble several times while in the military. He'd argued with the superiors, who he felt were discriminatory against him. Bearing in mind, again, we're still at a period of time where racial segregation is at an all-time high, and the black troops were separated from the white troops. And as a result of that, Sugar Ray Robinson would go to the superiors and argue against that and basically say, I ain't going to fight in these exhibitions. And that was because the African-American soldiers were not allowed to watch, in which he didn't feel was fair. So, again, also, rumour has it that as a result of this refusal, as a result of this him stepping up to the superiors, it turned out that apparently he actually was partly responsible for them being able to actually mix the two sets of troops together, which they'd previously not done. They previously tried to keep them segregated as it was on land in America. They tried to keep them segregated as well on tours, and it was partly due to Sugar Ray Robinson and Joe Louis, of course, as well, and these exhibition bouts, and obviously them complaining and refusing to do it, was so why they ended up getting mixed together, and obviously black people and white people that were serving in the army being sat there together enjoying a sport that they all loved, which I found was a very underrated story, because for years and years and years, 20, 30, 40 years after it, even today in 2020, there's still a lot of underlying racism that goes on, and it's just a bit of a crazy story, but a really nice story in some sense, that is their position of power that they had as professional fighters, as world heavyweight champion and as a welterweight star. They was able to put a little bit of influence into the United States military.
Yeah, and it's a great story, isn't it? I mean, it seems absolutely ridiculous now for the United States Army to be segregating. You know, you're all fighting the same war. You've got to all be fighting on the same battlefield, and you're meant to look after your guy. So it's incredible that they would segregate for times when, you know, a bit of respite, and, you know, God, you couldn't just barely imagine what it's like for those guys. So to have someone like Sugar Ray Robinson and Joe Lewis fighting an exhibition fight, I believe Henry Armstrong as well. So, you know, you've got these guys that are absolute legends, and that would give you a lift as a soldier, surely. So it just didn't make sense. But what a great story that Ray Robinson stood up to. And with Joe Lewis, we spoke about Joe Lewis was just not that type of person. Joe Lewis was never going to be the one to do that. So credit to Sugar Ray for that. And that's a great little story. And funny enough, Ray did end up actually defeating his childhood idol. And his childhood idol was the former champion, Henry Armstrong. And when he defeated Henry Armstrong, he was 131 wins, 18 defeats, and 7 draws. So it's a crazy, just the record are just mind-boggling, didn't they? Robinson, when he did fight Armstrong, he did actually say that he done it because he wanted to give Armstrong some money, and he said he was an old fighter, and obviously he was his childhood, his idol. So he actually said that later on in his career that he carried him through the fight just to give him the money, basically, because he was on hard times. So again, credit to Ray for that as well.
So 1943 would end with him only having competed in 6 official professional bouts, obviously due to the fact that he'd been inducted into the United States military as a result. So we move on to 1944 now. And in late March 1944, Sugar Ray Robinson was stationed at Fort Hamilton, which was in Brooklyn, waiting to ship out to Europe, where he was scheduled to perform more exhibition bouts. But on the 29th of March, Robinson disappeared from his barracks. Now, when he woke up on April the 5th in Fort J Hospital on Governor's Island, he had missed the sailing for Europe, and he was under suspicion of being a deserter from the army. First of all, he's waking up and not knowing where the hell he is. He's also being accused of deserting his post. He himself had reported falling down the stairs in his barracks on the 29th, but he said that he had complete amnesia. So as a result of his supposed fall, he'd lost a little bit of memory of what else happened after that, and he couldn't remember any events from that moment up until the 5th of April. Now, according to his file, a stranger found him in the street on April the 1st and helped him to a hospital. And after he was examined by a doctor, the examination report at Fort J concluded that Robinson's version of events was actually sincere, which is, again, another crazy story when looking back on what happened to him, that he actually lost, 6 days of his life, and he didn't have a clue what was going on. So he was examined by military authorities who claimed he'd suffered from a mental deficiency. So as a result of that, Robinson was actually granted honourable discharge on June the 3rd, 1944, and he later wrote that the unfair press coverage of the incident had branded him as a deserter. He lost 6 days of his life, essentially, because of a fall in the barracks. He's getting accused of being a deserter. He didn't have a clue what was happening. He's having to go and undergo all these medical tests to do it. And then obviously you've got the press, as usual, even way back in 1944, still doing what they love to do the most, which is to unfairly criticise somebody without knowing the true facts of a situation. Again, Sugar Ray Robinson, quite vocal about it, making sure that he made his thoughts known on that situation. But it was nice to obviously understand that he actually got honourably discharged after they actually deemed everything to be legitimately true as to what he was saying.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some people still to this day, historians have mentioned this, and they've said that they're not quite sure that the story is true. And I find that interesting because, I know he was a young lad, but considering how he ends his career, obviously we'll go into that later, it does make a little bit of sense. It's possible it could be true. Who knows? And, these things do happen. Clearly, he didn't want to be a part of it. He didn't want to go to Europe. And I think he did mention that to certain people that were sort of in and around his circle. So I believe that that's where historians are coming from, that he's made up a little story to get himself out of it. Either way, he did get honourable discharge, as you say, in 1944, which is great. And obviously, he wasn't considered by many as a deserter. And Robinson did maintain close friendship with Lewis. Obviously, he had known Joe Lewis for a long time in a way, from when he was young, carrying his gym bag from their time in the military service. They actually went into business together after the war as well. They actually planned to start a liquor distribution business in New York City, but they were actually denied a license. So they just fought in a war for the United States of America, and they can't grant these two absolute legends a license due to the colour of their skin. It's just crazy, isn't it? It was just a different era, and one that still just baffles me today.
So 1944 would end with only 5 fights, but with 5 wins and 4 knockouts, taking his overall record at the end of 1944 to 50 victories with 1 defeat and 34 knockouts on his record. So we move into 1945 now. And after 2 fights in January, the second of which was a 10-round decision over Tommy Bell, and then a knockout victory over George Costner on Valentine's Day, he goes back to Madison Square Garden for a 4th bout with Jake LaMotta, and this turned out to be another victory for Sugar Ray Robinson, and it was probably the most convincing victory over Jake LaMotta at this point in time. But for Sugar Ray Robinson, this was another great moment in his career where he moved on after beating Jake LaMotta, taking all but one of the 10 rounds, by the way, in this particular fight, and he moved on into Philadelphia on May the 14th. Now, at this moment for Ray, I think he's quite significant in the history books in terms of his actual career. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about his later career later on in the episode, but at this moment in time, bearing in mind, obviously, his record was a very, very good record at this point. He goes in to Philadelphia on May the 14th and fights a gentleman by the name of Jose Basora in front of a sellout crowd of 14,653 people at the convention hall. Now, according to the Associated Press at ringside, Robinson won 4 of the first 5 rounds, but wilted as Basora rallied to take round 6 through to round 9. Now, Basora was ahead on the newspaper scorecard going into the 10th. Robinson actually gained a draw by making Basora retreat in the last round with a series on lefts and rights. So this was the fight on his record which would go down as a draw. And looking at the accounts that we've been able to source for it and the newspaper reports on it, it sounded like it was a bit of a difficult night at the office for him.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I think he struggled a little bit, considering I think the first part of the fight as well. He took those first 5 rounds, and I think obviously, I don't know, as it says, he wilted. So Basora obviously rallied on and come through strong. So close fight, but it goes down as a draw. So that was his first draw. He had 1 loss and 1 draw now in his pro career. So 2 more knockouts followed June and early September, which set up a 5th meeting between Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta. And when you see this is the 5th meeting, it's just the first bit of Jake LaMotta's quote with, I fought sugar so many times, I'm surprised I'm not diabetic. I just think that's just the amount of times it comes up, it just pops into the head every time you see Jake LaMotta fighting Sugar Ray Robinson. Well, this time it was in Chicago. But this time, considering that he had won 1, lost 1, and he had 2 fights which he pretty much won comfortably. So this fight in particular was actually it was a bloody 12-round war, basically. Saw both men get hurt at some point. Ray won a wafer-thin decision, although many at ringside felt that LaMotta had just got the nod. Now, the Associated Press reported, this is exact words, this is what we pulled off, I think it's a Box Rec, so the crowd of 14,755 booed this decision, presumably because Robinson elected to fight cautiously in the last 3 rounds and backpedaled most of the way in the closing stages. So, make what you will out of that. It was a tough fight. By all sources, wherever you read it, wherever you find this online, you have a look at this fight in particular. The one thing that Sugar Ray Robinson would always say as well is that this was the toughest fight he had ever had with Jake LaMotta. So, by the sounds of it, it's one fight I would love to have seen. There's a few of Jake LaMotta's I would love to. I mean, there's several of Sugar Ray, but quite simply, it's just they just didn't have it. The film rules weren't out there.
The end of 1945 then brings him with 9 fights, 8 wins and 4 knockouts. Obviously, one of them being that draw with Basora, which we spoke about earlier, giving him a record of 58-1-1 with 38 knockouts going into 1946. So 1946 then, at this point in time, Sugar Ray Robinson is quite simply the best welterweight by a mile, with many observers and boxing fans basically saying, this guy needs a title shot, he deserves a title shot. Now the trouble was, the powers that be didn't want him to get a title shot, and that was mainly because of his colour. The biggest shame up until this point was that Ray's magnificent career and his welterweight campaign. Not a lot of the fights were filmed because there weren't a lot of filming that went on back in this particular era. So it was really difficult when you look back on the footage of what you can look back on. There's only limited bits of footage that you can find, which has been obviously picked up from all the film reels that have been knocking around from different boxing historians and people that maybe work for the promotional companies back in that particular era. You'd never really got to see his one-punch knockout power, the blistering speed, his cast-iron chin, and just obviously his sheer brilliance that can only be described in the press reports that we've pulled some of the information from. There is, however, some rare footage available. Now, his 4th round knockout wins over Tony Riccio and Cliff Beckett both have home video reels available, so you should go and check them out. You can find them on the internet, on YouTube. Now, 6 days after the first Beckett fight, Ray was actually promised a world title shot if he beats former foe Sammy Agnot for a 3rd time. So Ray did go on to outpoint the former lightweight champion for the last time, but still at this point, there was no title shot in sight.
Ray's style in the ring was to knock you out as soon as possible.
I guess he had a panache. You know, he could do it all. He could box, he could slug, he could defend himself. I once saw him knock out a guy moving backward. He was moving backward, not the guy. And knocked him out with a left hook, cold conked him.
I think boxing was always some people don't like it and some people do like it. And I guess he got more people to like it, really.
A great fighter is somebody that could always come back from the brink of destruction, and having over 202 fights, at least 80 and 90 of those fights, he's at the brink of destruction, almost losing and coming back to win. I mean, that shows the character.
Yeah, it's incredible. The 3rd time he fights Sammy Agnot. I mean, how many times? It's just crazy. I mean, we talk about Dillian White today. I mean, look at Ray Robinson. He's beating everybody. Anyone that's put in front of him, he's just going to continue to beat. And his record is just astonishing, but still nothing in sight. And this is 1946 now. I mean, it's getting a little bit ridiculous. So Robinson had now fought 75 fights with a record of 73 wins, 1 loss and 1 draw on his record. And he had beaten every single top contender in the welterweight division. However, his refusal to cooperate with the Mafia earlier in his career, it denied him a chance to fight for this welterweight championship for pretty much most of 1946. And you got to think as well, when I've looked through the sources, watched endless documentaries and whatever else I can find online, stuff that's been written, basically in 1946, the press wanted it, that everybody was talking about. Ray needed this title shot. It was getting beyond the point where it's ridiculous now. So even those big Mafia mobsters at the time, they just couldn't stop it anymore. It had to happen. And basically 1946, right at the end of 1946, literally a few days off the end of 1946, but he finally did get his title shot on the 20th of December in 1946, and he fought a guy called Tommy Bell, who was actually a good fighter, a very good fighter, Tommy Bell. He was 39, 10-2, and he challenged Robinson as well. So he was actually given this opportunity because Marty Servos actually vacated the title back in September. The reason why he vacated was from injuries he sustained against Rocky Graziano, funny enough as well. He stupidly decided to fight Rocky Graziano at middleweight and got absolutely pulverised to the point where he wasn't fit enough to fight, and then he actually ended up, from those injuries, having to retire. So, bad move for Marty Servo's team. But from that, he vacated the title and it gave the opportunity for Sugar Ray Robinson and Tommy Bell to fight out for that welterweight world title.
Well, it certainly did, and this wasn't the first time these two had met as well. They'd actually previously met earlier on in their careers. So when they did meet, it was a unanimous decision in favour of Sugar Ray Robinson. But the second time around, for the welterweight title of the world, it was a little bit more of a close affair. And Tommy Bell actually dropped Ray Robinson in the second, and also in the 11th as well. But of course, Sugar Ray Robinson repaid the compliment straight back, and during the verdict, everyone of the 15,000 people in attendance at the Madison Square Garden rose to their feet to applaud the new, long-awaited welterweight king, Sugar Ray Robinson.
Yeah, and it took him a while, didn't it? Jesus Christ, I mean, it is insane that, 73 1-1, and he finally gets his title shot from a vacated title is just crazy. But finally in that second fight, he does get that title, and he was king of the world. He was the king of the welterweight division. Unfortunately for him, it turned for him himself, because it wasn't long after he gave a gentleman that went by the name of Jimmy Doyle. Now, Jimmy Doyle was a good fighter. He was from Cleveland, and the fight was going to be at Cleveland, and it was on the 24th of June 1947, so a year later. So Jimmy Doyle was a bit of a folk hero in Cleveland, I believe. People perceived him as a very good fighter. Yeah, so Sugar Ray Robinson decided to give Jimmy Doyle a shot, and he would fight him in his own backyard.
The 24th of June 1947 was a date that will have always stuck out in the mind of Sugar Ray Robinson, because that was the date he defended his title against Jimmy Doyle, which we were speaking about. But this wouldn't be any box standard title defence. So in the lead up to this particular fight with Jimmy Doyle, the night before, in fact, Sugar Ray Robinson had what can only be described as a premonition, so to speak. A dream. He had a dream that he took on Jimmy Doyle, and in the fight with Jimmy Doyle, he landed a left hook, which subsequently knocked Jimmy Doyle to the floor and ended up causing Jimmy Doyle to pass away as a result of them injuries. The dream to Sugar Ray Robinson felt so real that on the day of the fight, he was basically wanting the commission to say, I want to cancel this fight. I want to cancel this fight because of this dream that I've had. And they must have been laughing in his face at this point. Who knows what they were saying to him? But when someone comes up to you and says, I've had a dream that this fight is going to get killed in the ring, all of a sudden, these doubts start to creep into his mind. And he was a little bit of a religious man, by all accounts. And he went and spoke to two priests, and the two priests assured him it was just a dream, and just forget about it. So he decided to go against his dream, go against his instincts. And amazingly, the dream became a reality, because in the fight, Sugar Ray Robinson landed a left hook, which dropped Jimmy Doyle to the floor, and subsequently, Jimmy Doyle passed away as a result of them injuries he sustained in the ring.
The night before the fight with him, I dreamed in my sleep that I knocked him out and he died in the ring. And I got up that morning and I told the commission that I wasn't going to fight. And they said, why? And I told them what I had dreamed, Aldo. They said, oh, Ray, no, that's just a dream. And they called a Catholic priest and a minister. And they came and they talked to me and told me to go ahead with the fight. And just like we dreamed, Aldo, I hit him a left hook and he died right there in the ring. It's terrible when you have a premonition before. You know, I had the premonition before that this was going to happen. And for a long time, Aldo, I couldn't fight. I couldn't fight. When I started again, I couldn't hit a man hard, you know. I was very trying.
Yeah, it's quite a story, isn't it? And was it a premonition? Was it a coincidence? That's always the thing I'd say. I mean, the one thing that we picked up on when we was going through Sugar Ray's career is that 15 months before Robinson fought Doyle, he actually suffered a critical concussion against a guy called Artie Levine. And many observers actually felt the reason for this particular incident with Sugar Ray was because of that, because many of them actually felt that his license probably should have been revoked from that point. I mean, I know it's 15 months beforehand, but obviously it was a really bad concussion that he suffered. So many felt that he should have been revoked. So therefore he's going into the ring where he probably wasn't 100% right. So whether Sugar Ray may have got wind of this, and he, you know, maybe that's what impacted him on his dream. Even way, as you say, as a religious man, he's going to think it was more of a premonition. But, you know, he obviously wasn't quite right. And it was actually a veteran scribe, Oscar Fraley, from New York, that actually didn't shy away from the point. Just point out the fact that greed and corruption was to blame for the death of Doyle. He felt in a way, and that was because that people knew that Doyle had this issue 15 months ago. His license probably should have been revoked. But yet, because of the greed and because of the corruption of the sport at that time in boxing, they allowed it to continue. So it's an interesting one. I suppose it's what you believe. Was it a premonition? Was it a coincidence? You know, I tend to stay on the side of a coincidence and maybe just picked up on this information and he's probably a bit worried going into the ring knowing how devastating the left hook he had.
It could have been that It could have been a premonition. It could have even been, in some people's eyes, an act of God. Who knows? We'll never get another story like that in boxing. I'm pretty sure of that.
Never.
But the aftermath of that happening, obviously Sugar Ray Robinson felt so bad about that he ended up writing a compassionate note to Doyle's mother and informed her that she would get half of his £25,000 purse or $25,000 purse against Flashy Sebastian. Now, Ray won that fight by a first-round knockout in what was the second quickest knockout in main event history at the Madison Square Garden. And that was only 2 months after the passing of Jimmy Doyle. Now, the photographers at ringside were talking about this particular fight against Flashy Sebastian because the knockout was so brutal that they were shouting, or heard to be shouting, get this, this guy may die too.
So distasteful, isn't it? I mean, it's just the era, I suppose. They want to get the shot just in case he dies. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it, really? But yeah, that's how it was. And on another benefit for Doyle, Ray actually did donate $6,500 towards a trust fund that was actually established for Doyle's mother, where she'd actually get $50 a month. So, you know, obviously he was put out by what happened, and it was damaging. And it was actually quite ironic as well that one of his other opponents, I don't know if it was exactly straight after, Chuck Taylor, actually ended up in hospital following kidney damage and had to be kept in for several days. So once again, the press were on that. So every fight that Sugar Ray Robinson was having at the time it just seemed to be highlighted as that he's going to kill someone in the ring again. It's a horrible time for Robinson, and I think it changed him as a person, because from that point he became very stringent in how he sort of dealt with his fights and how he managed his fights, and was a bit of he was really hard work, basically. And a lot of managers would turn around and say that, or promoters would say he was a nightmare to work with, an absolute nightmare, where if he didn't feel comfortable, he wouldn't take the fight. Credit to Ray, it changed him as a person, basically.
So he ended 1947 with 10 fights and 9 knockouts. Just as a side note to what was going on in 1947, it was around about 46 or even 47 that Sugar Ray bought his famous Sugar Ray's Cafe in Harlem. Now, the iconic Sugar Rays attracted celebrities like Frank Sinatra, Jackie Gleason, Nat King Cole, Elizabeth Taylor, and many more. Now, in Ray's autobiography, he said that women loved coming to the restaurant because it had rules, including a requirement that men check their hats and coats, no standing at the bar with a hat on his head and a coat on his arm, like he's getting ready to catch a bus. Now, Ray had built this small empire of businesses on the west side of 7th Avenue between 123rd and 124th Street in Harlem. And now that included not only Sugar Ray's, but it included a barbershop, a boutique, a bar and grill, and of course, the showplace of Harlem, Sugar Ray's. And outside of the club, as always, would be the famous pink Cadillac, which he called the Hope Diamond of Harlem.
Yeah, there's an interesting story later on about how he actually got that pink Cadillac, which he actually likes to call a pink flamingo Cadillac as well. So we'll get into that later on. And it's actually in Will Hager's book, The Sweet Thunder, which was the life and times of Sugar Ray Robinson. And he basically paints a bit of a romantic picture of Robinson cutting his stylish figure around Harlem, chatting with the likes of Langston Hughes, who was an American poet, escorting Lena Horne, who was an American singer, or giving boxing lessons to Miles Davis, who was a famous American jazz trumpeter. And Robinson was always dapper, and he actually said that he turned his life into a waltz through the times in which he lived, which I thought was quite a nice little quote there from Will. Yeah, we just thought we'd stick that in because obviously it was a major part of the time, and he was just as famous as Frank Sinatra in the 40s and 50s. So, you know, many celebrities and stars went to Ray's Cafe. So, you know, it was just showing you that just how much of an empire that Sugar Ray Robinson was building at the time.
So we're moving to 1948 then. Now, 1948, again, as a side note, it was a really good year for the sport of boxing because there was a wealth of grudge matches that happened in that year. Now, Joe Louis knocked out Jersey Joe Walcott. We had Tony Zale knocking out Rocky Graziano in their rubber match, which, if it's a trilogy you've never heard of in boxing, it should be one that you go and check out, and the story of it. Great trilogy, underrated trilogy. And then you also had the French icon, Marcel Sedan, who stopped Tony Zaya with a stunning left hand that put him to sleep on his feet. So again, 1948 had some great matches. Now, we're going back to Sugar Ray Robinson here, and he was fast becoming a middleweight by this point. And it was at this point he started to struggle to make 147 pounds, the welterweight limit. And in a defence of his welterweight crown against Bernard Ajuscan, he had to starve himself for 2 days to make the weight. And then after tipping the scales at 146.5 pounds, he drank beef broth and munched off a 2.5 pound boiled steak. And this was the first bit of solid food in 48 hours, along with forced dehydration, just to shed them 5 pounds.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, he was already fighting at middleweight, so it was becoming a struggle to defend his title. Obviously, back then, once you're a champion, you don't have to defend your title every time, mainly because they're fighting so regularly. And he felt comfortable at middleweight, and middleweight was basically his weight, more or less. But he was the welterweight champion, and he didn't obviously feel that he was ready to move into the middleweight division just yet. In a stunning, action-packed first fight with Kid Gavilan, who's a future welterweight champion at this point, wasn't quite there yet. And it was just 2 days after Sedana actually defeated Zale to win the world middleweight champion in Jersey City. And that fight was actually named Fight of the Year in 1948 by Ring Magazine. So Ray won the non-title fight. It wasn't a title fight at the time at the Yankee Stadium that many observers felt was a clear win for Ray. But it was the fans that actually see it in a different way, and they were very disappointed with the result, and they let they were quite open about it. They basically booed the decision, and it was actually Gavilan's manager, Little Angel Lopez, who actually declared, if Robinson doesn't sign to defend Gavilan again, I will keep Robinson's forfeited $5,000 he lost yesterday when he weighed in at 150 pounds and 150 and a half pounds. Now, Ray had actually posted 5,000 to the 20th Century Club, who were promoting the fight, under a private agreement with the Gavilan camp that he would weigh no more than 150 pounds.
So, James P. Dawson of the New York Times wrote that the fans disagreed violently with the verdict in Robinson's favour and set up such a roar of disagreement that the introduction of the championship principles was delayed until the order was restored. So there you go. There you go. It just goes to show you, doesn't it, how much of a bit of an infamous fight that was at the time as well. And it's certainly a part of Sugar Ray Robinson's career that, we always urge you to go back and look at certain parts of his career. This is another one. So this would really bring an end to 1948, and he only had 5 fights and no knockouts this year in 1948, which was obviously strange for Sugar Ray Robinson because he'd built a career on knocking out most of his opposition. So we're moving to 1949. Now, he moves into a fight with a gentleman named Henry Brim. Now, this fight was described by The Ring on May 1949. Brim amazed the Fistic Brigade by holding the Great Robinson to a 10-round draw. Ray appeared far off form, and it appears that the once brilliant Harlem lad has slowed down to a walk.
And The Ring's description of Ray's performance might seem a little bit harsh, but they weren't too far from away from their assessment, to be fair. I mean, Ray did completely overlook Brim. He felt that he was nothing more than a pushover, especially after the fact that he defeated him in a 10-round decision the year before. But one thing people didn't realise is that Brim actually had a comeback ability, and it was the fact that he was left for dead in Normandy Sands on D-Day, and is actually reported killed in action. So, this fella was no pushover, and he managed to score a draw against Sugar Ray, and a fantastic result for him. Just before Ray took on Gavilan in a rematch, he was actually caught as well by Edna May, his wife at the time, on Lover's Lane overlooking the Harlem River with a young lady that he pulled from his cafe. Now, not the best preparations for his big fight that he was going into against that man, Kid Gavilan. Their relationship was pretty rocky in a way, and whether it had actually hit the rocks or it was heading that way or had, I mean, he was a bit of a promiscuous guy, Sugar Ray Robinson, and obviously this cafe and loads of young ladies around. He had a bit of a wandering eye. So 5 months later in Philadelphia, Kid Gavilan, he got his warranted shot. Now, it was after his obviously excellent performance in the first encounter. In this fight in particular, in this rematch, it was interesting. Ray was given an injection of glucose by his doctor, Vincent Nardello. It provided Ray with a bit of an extra prep after struggling to make weight. So, it was just a little boost, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, really struggling with the weight at this point. And the title on the line. Gavilan was an up-and-comer, and he was a tough fella. And Gavilan did have his moments in the 14th where he rocked Ray twice, but in the end, he basically old-manned him. Got through the fight towards the end, and the champ went on to win by unanimous decision. And it was actually Ray's biggest purse of $51,740. Previous biggest was $25,000, which he donated over to the Doyle Trust Fund, or to Doyle's mum, or half of it anyway. And it was the first time one of his fights actually made $100,000 on the gate as well.
Wow. So there you go. He's starting to earn a lot more money at this point, and we've talked about him throughout the years as being this marquee star, and he's certainly getting the rewards of that as well. And, you know, he was a master of the ring, and by all accounts, as you was telling us a little bit earlier, a master between the sheets as well, pulling birds from Sugar Ray's all the time. So as we move on, Associated Press staff writer Hugh Fullerton wrote about this particular fight with Gavilan. Now, for the first 7 rounds against a younger and finely conditioned opponent, Sugar Ray knew he'd been in a fight. Then he stepped out to show he was the boss, and he did it expertly. Gavilan never stopped trying, but after the 7th round, that was about all he could do. So we're moving on now. In April of 1949, Ray signed with Tournament of Champions, which was a protein promotional organisation which was challenging the Jacobs dynasty, and he was to fight Steve Belois for a guaranteed purse of $25,000. He immediately obtained $5,000 of that for training expenses. Now, the Jacobs organisation, who we've spoke about earlier in the episode, was 20th Century Club. They represented the Garden, of course, at the time, and the Tournament of Champions were competing for the match. So Jacobs and his lawyer, Saul Strauss, called Robinson to their office. A Garden spokesman said that he'd agreed to fight Belois for $20,000 and then borrowed $1,000. Strauss wanted Ray to sign the contract, but then Ray said he would come back the next day and sign. So Strauss said no, but Jacobs said, forget it, you don't think a guy who's just borrowed $1,000 will go back on his word, do you? So what happened then is Ray actually left. He walked 1 block and signed for the Tournament of Champions for the guaranteed $25,000.
He's a cheeky little son, isn't he? So he's going to take it. He took $1,000. He did go back on his word, obviously, and actually ended up earning himself $26,000. So, yeah, he was, you know, it was his Ray Robinson. Yeah, it's one thing you all know is since the Doyle fight, he didn't take he was no mug basically, and he weren't interested in. He didn't really give a shit, to be honest. And if he didn't, you know, he was Ray Robinson, wasn't he? You know, it doesn't matter. So, so the winner of Robinson and the Bronx vet, who had 103 fights, who was Belois, was actually promised a world title shot against Jake Lamotta or Marcel Sedan, who were due to have their rematch. Now, Sedan was interested in the fight, obviously. You know, he was the challenger now after Lamotta took his title from him, and Sedan went to watch both of the fighters in training camps. And he actually forecasted that Ray would lose the fight because he felt that Belois, basically, he hit hard and he had a weight advantage. Now, this was Ray's 100th fight. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? And he came into the ring with a brilliant 96 wins, 1 loss and 2 draws record of 63 KOs. And he basically produced an absolute masterclass. Now, if it weren't for the final bell or the bells during the fight that was saving his resolute opponent, it would have ended a lot sooner. So Ray knocked him down in the 3rd and the 6th. Both times he was saved by the bell. The veteran was then saved by the bell a 3rd time in the 7th, but this time he was literally out cold, where his corner, his seconds came in, picked him basically off of the canvas, took him to the corner, and they tried desperately to wake him up so he could come back for the next round. Unfortunately, he couldn't, and the referee stopped the fight.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm telling you, you wouldn't get away with this in this day and age, that's for sure. Now, let's go back and look at what the journalist was saying at the time. So many of the writers and observers was waxing lyrical about Ray's performance on that particular night. Now, one particular scribe, Oscar Fraley, called him the canvas decorator. And James Bronson, who was also known as James Bowtie Bronson, said he was the best he had seen since Joe Gans, and Nat Fleischer, the famous Nat Fleischer, called him Harlem Hotshot. So he ended 1949 with 13 fights and 8 stoppages. Pretty successful year for him that year, of course. And we now move in to 1950. Now, 1950 was Ray's most active year since 1941. He actually took part in 19 bouts in just that 12-month period. Starting from the 30th of January up until the 27th of February, Ray Robinson stopped George LaRosa in 4, Al Mobley in 6, Aaron Wade in 3, and the Frenchman Gene Walzak by decision, which was their first encounter. And then on the 22nd of March, Sugar George Costner was Ray's next victim. Now, this was their second meeting following a first-round knockout of his namesake 5 years earlier. Now, this next extract that we've got is actually from the autobiography of Sugar Ray Robinson. And it says, "I was in Philadelphia once for a fight with George Costner, a tough puncher who also liked to call himself Sugar. In the days before the fight, he kept telling the sports writers how there was only going to be one Sugar, as in him. But after the referee gave us the instructions in the middle of the ring, I held my gloves out. Better touch gloves now, I told Costner, because this is the only round. Your name ain't Sugar, mine is." 2 minutes and 49 seconds later, Costner didn't look so sweet anymore.
I think, yeah, I've heard a story from Sam Langford doing the same thing there, where he sort of said it's the first time you're touching gloves because you don't touch gloves in the second round. And I think Sugar Ray probably pinched that from Langford. He don't mess about, does he? And so the fight description, Costner was aggressive from the start, and he hurt Robinson with a right to the body, but he responded by scoring a crisp left and right. Then Ray was true to his word as he landed a terrific 1-2 that sent Costner down for the full count. So, you know, he basically weren't playing. He pissed him off, and Ray doesn't like that, and he ended the fight quite quickly. So Ray then went on to stop Cliff Beckett for the second time in 3 rounds before decisioning Ray Barnes in comfortable fashion. He actually won it 56-44, 57-43, and 59-41 on all 3 judges' scorecards. But Barnes did give a good account of himself. Now, from 1946, Ray had pretty much fought over the 147-pound limit when he wasn't defending his title. So it was no surprise when he stepped up to the middleweight and won the vacant Pennsylvania title, which is a title that Pennsylvania had put together. So it's not the world title, it's their own title, basically. And he actually won that by unanimous decision against a French guy called Robert Villemin in Philadelphia. Now, Robert Villemin was a tough French geezer, and he actually beat Jake LaMotta around this time as well. So a good win for Sugar Ray.
So after taking July off of that year in 1950, he opted to defend his welterweight title for a 5th time, and it was also a last time against Charlie Fusari, with a current record which now stood at 110 wins in 112 fights. Now, Ray came in a quarter of a pound overweight. So yet again, we're hearing a story of where he's really struggling with his weight at this point, going down to welterweight. So he basically went off yet again to sweat it out for an hour before returning and coming in just under the 147-pound limit. Now, Fusari boxed pretty well on that night and stayed out of trouble in front of his New Jersey faithful, but Ray ended up getting a comfortable decision. So after a closely fought draw in their first fight, Ray was able to exact revenge over Jose Pessoa with a 1-round knockout. And we talked about Jose Pessoa earlier on because he was obviously a guy who Sugar Ray had got his first and only draw with at this point in time. So we're back here against Pessoa, and this time he ends it in emphatic fashion, getting the 1-round knockout. So after this, he decides to go on a trip to Miami and he attends the Hialeah racetracks. Now, he became fascinated by the flamingos in the infield, so much so that he figured flamingo would look just dandy on his new car. So what he goes and does next is he orders a white Cadillac Eldorado, took it to a dealer, along with a flamingo pink tie, and asked them to spray the car the same colour. So this is where his pink Cadillac came from. So we always wondered where this flashy pink Cadillac came from and why was it pink? We never knew the story of that, and this is the story of it. So he ends up going seeing the flamingo, decides to go and see a dealer, gets his car sprayed pink, and that is the story of Sugar Ray Robinson's pink Eldorado Cadillac.
Oh, Sugar Ray Robinson was a great boxer, great puncher, smart. He knew how to move, he knew how to counter. He did everything and did it well. Sugar Ray, I think, is one of the all-time greats. I think he'll go down in the history, along with the original Joe Walcott, as the greatest welterweight champ we ever had.
Yeah, and it cost Ray $300. He was delighted with it, he said, and a quote from him is that it was not only exclusive, it was a symbol. When people think they recognise a celebrity, they hesitate a moment. But when they saw me in that car, they didn't have to hesitate at all. They knew there was only one like it, Sugar Ray's pink Cadillac. Most people called it pink, but to me, it was always more than pink. It was flamingo pink. So he was a bit obsessed with, obviously, people looking at him. Ray, I mean, it was a handsome chap, wasn't he, Ray? I mean, even after all the years, he thought he still looked pretty good. He was pristine and he enjoyed people's company. You know, he loved that. So, anyway, getting back to the fight, following wins over Billy Brown, Joe Rindone, Bob Olsen, who will also pop up later on, and Bobby Dykes, Ray decided that he needed a holiday. So, he went on tour. He went on a tour of Europe in preparation for a title shot against the newly crowned champion, who we spoke about earlier, Jake LaMotta. Now, he first defeated Frenchman Gene Stock by a knockout with a devastating left hand in Paris. Then, Luke Van Dam in 4 rounds after a beautifully timed left to the body and an uppercut, which stopped the Dutchman in Brussels. He outpointed the second Frenchman he faced, which was Gene Woolzock, in Geneva, Switzerland, before a rematch again with Robert Vilman in Paris. They fought him in America, and then he had the second fight in Paris, which was stopped by the referee following a barrage of lefts and rights in the ninth. Ray's final victim was German Hans Stretz, who just couldn't deal with the rampant onslaught from Ray, and in the end the fight was stopped. And that was the end of his European tour. But it was all preparation for one man in particular, and that was, of course, Mr. Jake LaMotta.
I remember that evening because I had fought Jake LaMotta 6 times. We fought LaMotta. I won 5 times, and he won 1. And this time was a 6th time, and it was the only time I knocked him out.
So that ends 1950 then. 1950 ends with 19 fights and 12 knockouts, and a European tour, and a pink Cadillac, and getting caught cheating on his wife on Lover's Lane. Plenty of ups and downs for him in that particular year anyway. So we move into 1951, and in January of 1951, Sugar Ray Robinson collected the Edward J. Neal Award for the boxer who did the most for the sport in 1950. So he'd already started the year off fantastically well by getting this award for what he did the year earlier. Now we move into Jake LaMotta, the 6th and final fight, which we've recently covered for our Legendary Nights podcast, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So if you want to hear more about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, you can go and do a full, in-depth podcast on the Legendary Nights podcast feeds. Please go and check that out. You'll really, really fully enjoy it. But obviously, as we know from that particular fight, it was the 6th and final time these two would get in the ring together, and Sugar Ray Robinson would absolutely decimate Jake LaMotta in that particular fight. And Jake LaMotta was obviously stopped on his feet, which gave us the infamous film The Raging Bull. So the Bronx Bull was stopped on his feet in that particular fight, giving us the 1980 film that a lot of boxing fans love so much, The Raging Bull. But again, an infamous night, but one of them nights which you can always speak about with Sugar Ray Robinson as one of the greatest nights of his career.
Yeah, it was an outstanding performance for him, and then Jake LaMotta put in a valiant display, I suppose, in the early moments of that fight. But yeah, it was just Sugar Ray's master plan. He put it into play, and he ended the fight, and hence the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, because he absolutely massacred him in those last sort of 3 rounds. And so he was the new ring and the lineal middleweight champion. Now, Ray Robinson fought twice in April before he went on his second tour of Europe, but this time as the middleweight champion of the world. So at this point in his career, Ray considered himself to be boxing royalty. So when taking an 8-week tour of Europe, he was accompanied by 9 people and 53 pieces of luggage.
Wow.
Ray would also travel with his trainer, George Gainford, who he called, was it a Messiah? I can't remember. He actually had nicknames for everyone as well, by the way. And I can't remember off the top of my head. He took a golf pro, he took a nutritionist, a manicurist, a chauffeur, his barber Roger, whose last name has been lost. No one knows his last name. It's Barber Roger. And even a court jester to keep him, or he was like a dwarf court jester as well, which is just even worse, to keep him in a good mood. So when boarding the boat, which was called the Liberty or the Liberté, I think it would have been going from the Harlem River as well, the steward called out for Ray Robinson and his entourage to get on board. Now, Ray loved the sound of that word, and he would basically adopt that phrase for the rest of his career. Sugar Ray Robinson, his entourage. If you ever look at Sugar Ray from this point in 1951, it's always Ray and his entourage, and it grows. I'm putting it this way, it grows large.
I tell you what, like, Sugar Ray Robinson was like a modern day diva at that point. Nine people and 53 pieces of luggage. So in that list you just given there, a golf pro, a nutritionist, a manicurist, a chauffeur, a barber Roger, which just sounds hilarious, and then you've got a dwarf court jester just to basically keep him happy. Well, these are the stories that you won't hear anywhere else. This is Sugar Ray Robinson, folks, and the career profile of him. So Ray then kick-started his tour with a 5th round knockout in Paris against Kid Marcel. In attendance was a London promoter by the name of Jack Solomons, and after the fight, he approached George Gainford. He asked about a title defence in London against Randolph Turpin. Now, Ray told George, "You can handle this guy, don't accept anything less than $100,000. So Solomons walked out, but the next day, Ray overheard George speaking with Jack, saying, "Oh, you got me beat. I'll give you $100,000. George was more than happy, but he wanted to change the date from the 10th of July, as Ray would be fighting on the 9th and the 1st of July in Turin. So Ray again told George, "Don't worry about the date. I'll fight Turpin and everybody in England for $100,000.
And that was the fight sealed. So he wasn't supposed to be fighting in London. I think he was meant to go London, but I weren't too. I think they had already planned it out because they had so many. He had like a French manager, a Belgian manager. This is just his entourage was just growing. It was unreal. And so yeah, this obviously come out of the blue, and Jack Solomons was quick. He sorted it out, and yeah, $100,000. So it's a tricky one. I mean, Turin now. I mean, if he was in Turin on the 1st of July, you've got to then get to London on the 10th of July. I mean, all right, we've got an easy jet. We can get back quite easily. But these days, it is a boat. That's a bit of a tough ask. But you know, even though he was in luxury and had all these entourage, but 5 days after the Kid Marcel fight, Ray appointed Gene Wands in Switzerland before heading to Belgium. So he scored 2 knockouts, one over Jan de Brim, and the other in a rematch against Jack Walzak. Now, in a bizarre fight in Germany against a crowd favourite who was Gerard Hetch, I think his name is, Heck, Robinson was disqualified by the referee Otto Nispel for an illegal kidney blow. Now, in Germany, you couldn't throw body punches, funny enough, or it was a weird rule they had over there. So the result was that later on, anyway, in America you could, obviously, and the result was later on overruled by the German Boxing Commission, ruling it as a no contest. And then from that point, it was on to Turin to fight a Belgian fighter called Cyril Delaunay, and he basically retired in the 3rd round. So, which then put us in a position where, as we just mentioned earlier with Solomons, he was going to go to London, he was going to fight in Earl's Court against a certain Randy Turpin.
Wow, well, this, again, great fight in history here, and one of the biggest upsets in boxing history, I suppose. This is definitely something that I think would definitely constitute a legendary night. So, Ray and his entourage, as he'd love to be known as, made their 7th and last stop in London at Earl's Court Arena in Kensington. And this was against the current British Empire and European welterweight champion Randy Turpin. Now, once again, going back to Will Haygood's book, he wrote, "People followed him everywhere. He required a police escort, and the bobbies circled him as he moved about. Sugar Ray Robinson was a fully fledged international star. And although Ray was a star and was rumoured to have spent much of his time on the golf course by day or at the cards table at night, the former bricklayer was not fazed by all the glitz and the glamour that surrounded Sugar Ray Robinson. So on the 10th of July 1951, 5 months after winning the middleweight title in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre against Jake LaMotta, Turpin produced a massive upset to win the ring and lineal middleweight titles by outpointing Sugar Ray Robinson, and in doing so, of course, becoming a national hero over here in the UK. And Sugar Ray Robinson went back to America with his tail between his legs, publicly addressed the nation by insisting that he will do his best to bring the middleweight championship back to America.
I had a very nice time in Europe. Very sorry that I did not bring back the championship, but I promise you I'll do the best I can September the 12th to bring the middleweight championship back to America. I'm sure that the new champion will do the best he can to hold that championship for England a long time. But well, I think we both have the same idea. I kind of want to get it back here to America.
Yeah, and he was a bit put out. I mean, his wife actually came out and publicly said, Edna May, saying that she felt that Randy Turpin should have been the fight to begin the tour, and they put it down to that, you know, he was out playing it. I mean, there was excuses, but either way, 64 days later, and true to his word, Ray did get his revenge, this time at the Polo Grounds in New York by stopping Turpin in the 10th of a scheduled 15. But it wasn't plain sailing. So Ray was actually cut in the first fight, which we obviously didn't mention, and probably he didn't give himself enough time, 64 days, surely with a bad cut, probably not enough time for rematch. But once again in the second fight, the cut had opened over Robinson's left eyebrow, same cut as well, with the added concoction of Turpin's awkward style and the cut getting worse. The fight was beginning to slip away. Turpin was slowly creeping in front on the scorecards, and many felt he was ahead going into that 10th round. It was at this point that referee Ruby Goldstein walked over to Ray's corner and said, "I'm going to start the fight." Ray responded by saying, "Give me another round," and Goldstein agreed. So Ray came out in that 10th round, and he went for broke. He just went for it, and he actually landed a thunderous right hand that put Turpin down to the canvas. Turpin, to his credit, actually got back to his feet, but then a punishing onslaught from Ray followed, with Turpin up against the ropes. A load of unanswered shots came left and right, to the body, to the head. Goldstein jumped in and stopped the fight, and Ray became a two-time middleweight champion.
This is legendary status at this point in time, and he becomes a two-time middleweight champion to go along with obviously the welterweight championship that he'd won a couple of years earlier. So at this point, yeah, he's an absolute icon, isn't he? He's an icon of his time at this point, surely. And it was one of the greatest career performances of Sugar Ray Robinson as well, by all accounts. Yeah. He goes back and he goes back on what he said he was going to do, which was reclaim the middleweight title and obviously bring it back to America. He did it obviously in America, but again, it was great for boxing in general at this point, him being the star that he was, obviously getting that shock defeat to Turpin, reclaiming the crown. So after this particular fight and following this particular victory, Sugar Ray Robinson was quoted as saying, "After my eye got cut, it was do or die. I didn't want to take any chances with the referee stopping the fight." So let's go through a couple of comparisons between these two fights, because I think, again, these are fights that I do believe to be quite underrated. So Robinson's purse was $84,000 and Turpin received only $25,500. And it was a sellout crowd of 18,000, and it produced a gate of over, I think it was £250,000 that the report said. So it's a hell of a lot of money at this point in time. So you go into the second fight, the rematch, which was in front of a crowd of 61,370 people, which produced a gate of $767,630. Now, there was also movie rights to be shown. Obviously, this was also going to make more money off it, and that was $200,000. And then there was theatre television rights, which was $25,000. And Robinson's share of this was 30%, which was approximately just under $250,000.
Wow.
And Randy Turpin would end up getting 25%, so he would still walk away with $210,000. So both of them would walk away with just under $250,000 from both of these fights. And again, I always make the comparison of how much that would probably equate to today, and you're probably looking at a good couple of £1 million here between them.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's just crazy how the first fight, obviously, with it being over here and no one really give Turpin a chance. He earns $25,500, and in his second fight he earns over $200. I mean, that's just incredible for Randy Turpin. That's another. I mean, Randy Turpin is an interesting story. If no one ever knows about Randy Turpin, do check out his career, because it's a sad ending for Turpin. But you know, at the end of the day, Sugar Ray Robinson ended 1951 with 11 fights, 6 stoppages, 11 wins, obviously. And in 1952, this is where we move into now. So on March 13th, Ray made his first defence of the middleweight title against Bobo Olsen in their second meeting at the San Francisco Civic Auditorium in front of a crowd of 10,000, or just over. Now that produced a gate of 63,000. Robinson missed with a left hook in the 10th round, lost his balance, and went down on his knee. Olsen showed fine sportsmanship and stepped back until Robinson regained his feet, which is actually a really nice thing to do. Robinson said the fight was as tough a battle as he had ever had. He also donated all but $1 of his purse to the Damon Runyard Cancer Fund, and I think that Damon Runyard was a friend of his, and it was always a big thing for him, cancer, and I mean, with all the stuff, and he was promiscuous, and the fact that, you know, we'll go into briefly, but the fact that he was a bit handy with his hands with old Edna May as well. So, but the one thing he did do was he did give a lot to charity, and the cancer funds were always one that he always donated to. So yeah, we donated his purse, all but $1. And the reason, that story behind that, is the guy that used to run the fund, they said, "Oh, you can't give me all your money, Ray." And Ray just sort of said, "Well, all right, well, I'll keep $1 then if it makes you happy." And that was why he always kept $1. So all the things that he ever did, he was a bit of an enigma. He had about 5 different personalities, Sugar Ray Robinson. He always did donate a lot of money to charity, so credit to him for that.
So he'd move on then into his next fight. And it was Rocky Graziano, another legendary name in the sport of boxing. He was the next person on the list for Sugar Ray Robinson. And Rocky Graziano would actually go in and floor Sugar Ray Robinson with the right hand. And it looked more like a slip than anything. So Ray jumps up off the deck and he knocks out Rocky Graziano with a great laugh rate combination. And he knocked the gum shield out of his mouth and into the ringside seats. So we've seen this throughout Sugar Ray Robinson's career. You get anywhere near him, or you land a glove on him, or you even get lucky enough to put the guy in the seat of his pants, and he'll just get up and he'll knock you the hell out. And this is exactly what he did to Rocky Graziano. So it's at this point now, he's cleaned up the middleweight division. He's previously cleaned up welterweight. He's now cleaned up the middleweight division, and he dared to become even greater. So he attempted to claim another title at a third weight, moving alongside Henry Armstrong and Bob Fitzsimmons, and his opponent was Giuseppe Antonio Berdanelli, aka Joey Maxime, and he was managed by the excellent Jack Kearns, who was also known as Doc, and he guided Jack Dempsey's career and Mickey Walker's career. Now, Maxime was the reigning ring and lineal light heavyweight world champion, but he wasn't known for his punching power, so although he did have one thing going for him, he kept on winning. So George Ganford was confident that Ray could even win this fight, even though he'd be giving away just over a stone in weight, which was 15.5 pounds. Gainford knew that Maxime, even with that advantage, couldn't knock Ray Robinson out. This opponent was also to be considered as the perfect opportunity to win the light heavyweight title because of that very reason. The other contender knocking around at the time was another legendary name in Archie Moore, and that would have been a hell of a lot harder of a feat than facing off against Joey Maxime.
Yeah, it would have been, a Maxime, considered to be a bit of a light puncher, and obviously they felt he wanted to go for another title. It was a perfect chance, and many observers, they used the mottos that we use today. Does a good big man can always beat a good little man. Now, the Ray fans would always turn around and say he's a great little man, and he'll be able to beat a minuscule big man, and that was how people were plugging the fight. And the fight was scheduled for Monday the 23rd of June 1952, but was actually postponed until Wednesday night because of rain and cold. Now, the irony of that change of date will impact on the result, as by Wednesday the weather would have changed quite dramatically, and it actually just dramatically changed that much that it went into the record books. And the record books, actually, it was really strange because obviously with it being cold on a Monday, and then the next day it was like the hottest 25th of June in the history of New York City, with the New York Weather Bureau, and it actually totaled 104 degrees at ringside and 130 degrees in the ring, with the addition of the heat from the ring lamps. So, I mean, you can't even imagine trying to fight in that. Jesus Christ. So the one thing I say is this is probably one of the best performances from Sugar Ray Robinson, although he did lose. It's crazy. So Ray boxed superbly throughout, and Maxim was basically being scored for much of the fight by the smaller man. So Ray, as I say, it was Ray's best performance. It was in the 10th round that actually Ruby Goldstein was so groggy and in a haze that he couldn't even work out who was hitting who at this point because the heat was just too much being a referee. So he was actually substituted for a new ref called Ray Miller. So Ray Miller came in and took over for the last 5 rounds. So God knows what the fighters must be going through. By this stage, both fighters were basically slowed considerably, but Ray was clearly feeling it more because he did a lot more work in there than Maxim, and he basically had a substantial lead. Now, by the 12th and 13th round, Ray was staggering and stumbling back to his corner. In the 13th, Ray missed with a right hand, fell flat on his face. And then after the 13th, Ray was actually helped back by his corner. His corner actually came into the ring, moved him back, sat him back down. He took his minute break. They had ice packs, smelling salts. They even had a physiotherapist in there, which was approved by one of the doctors, but it was all in vain. Because in the end, the heat exhaustion prevented Ray from coming out of that corner. And he unfortunately had to quit. Well, I say quit. He physically couldn't get off his stool and the fight was stopped. So Ray dared to be great. Unfortunately, the weather done him more than the actual fighter, who was Maxie.
That's a crazy story. Absolutely crazy story. Like, absolutely bossing the fight, only to be denied by an act of God, some might say, yet again, the weather, basically. And it's just such a shame that he never was able to come out for that, because again, that would have added to his history, and it would have made even more history, and we would have been talking about this in a different light. So what was also quite crazy about this fight was it was that hot in the ring at that time. Incredibly, Joey Maxine lost 9 pounds fighting in the ring. Most of it will probably obviously be fluids from out of the body. And Sugar Ray Robinson lost 11 pounds. And
wow.
Sugar Ray Robinson was actually delirious straight after the bout. He was unable to hold his own weight. And the next morning, he was covered with a complete fever and blisters, which were a result of his boiling blood. He didn't even eat for the next 2 days because he couldn't even retain anything in his stomach. And for several days after that, he was unable to leave the house. He was so dehydrated that it almost cost him his life. That fight, that attempt to dare to be great, almost cost him his life.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, just to go up to light heavyweight was a mean feat and give away 15.5 pounds, but then to then have to go through that as well, it's just crazy. So it was at the Yankee Stadium. It set record receipts of $421,615,000 plus the approximate $100,000 for theatre TV in front of a crowd of 47,983 for the light heavyweight championship. So for the light heavyweight championship, it actually beat the mark set in 1926 when Paul Berlenbeck and Jack Delaney drew a gate of 461,000, but obviously without the extra TV theatre in Ebbsfleet. Their fight was in Ebbsfield, Brooklyn. So, it basically beat a record in Madison Square Garden for a light heavyweight attendance. And there was no surprise to anyone when Ray announced his retirement, and he was now ready to listen to offers that were being waved in his face to try a career in show business. So he was booked into the French casinos at the Paramount Hotel, open on the 7th of November for 4 weeks at $15,000 a week. He followed that up with an agreement to perform at the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas, which was a massive, obviously, a big hotel at the time, and it would make himself $60,000 for another month. So he basically decided to retire, and he moved into show business world, and he had himself booked in before anyone actually even see him dance, just because of his name. That's how it works. Ended 1962 with 3 fights, 2 wins and 1 loss.
So we move in now to the years that he retired for. So 1953 to 1955, we're going to cover what happened during that period of his retirement. So ironically, throughout his career, Ray Robinson had actually managed to stay away from associates of the mob in a 12-year boxing career. So he'd managed to get away from all the stronghold that the mob had on boxing. He created this legacy for himself. He was a celebrity, basically, so the mob didn't want to go near him. As I said earlier, they kind of preyed on people where, they really needed to push for that world title, and they needed someone to push them on extra. Jake LaMotta was a prime example of that. He ended up moving into show business, and he developed a friendship with a gentleman named Joe Glazer, the president of the Association Booking Company, which was one of the biggest agents in show business. But the trouble with this and this relationship was he was also once the frontman for the Capone organisation. This is the Al Capone organisation, when he was an influential fight promoter in Chicago. Ray's kind of now becoming a little bit affiliated in some ways with the mob. So he would end up loaning Ray $122,000 to assist his comeback. But Glazer was also a shrewd businessman, and he covered himself by taking out mortgages on a string of buildings and stores in Harlem, which was Ray's nest egg, basically. So all them properties that Ray had, and he'd built himself a little mini empire in Harlem, he ended up obviously getting mortgages taken out on these buildings to basically fund all this. So when Ray Robinson did perform his dance routine, many were pleasantly surprised and even impressed by his tap number. So this goes back to the very start of the episode when we was talking about how his mother was paying for the dancing lessons well early on in his career, and obviously he ended up deciding to sneak off and go to boxing. So going back to this particular story, so the main promoter in boxing during Ray's hiatus from the ring was Jim Norris. Now, he was the first to indicate a return to the ring for the former welterweight and middleweight champion. He explained that taxes and travelling expenses leave a performer with little profit nowadays. He also went on to say that because of the great interest in the middleweights, I believe Sugar Ray will come back.
There's more stories, and in those 2 years, I mean, I think you could probably write a book in what he did in those 2 years, to be honest with you. But I mean, this is a boxing podcast, so we're going to stick with his career. So not only was there an added incentive of returning to the ring to earn more money, but Ray was also becoming, his life was getting scrutinised by the press, by his wavering performances on the stage. Obviously, he had a good start, and then it started to deteriorate. He actually went over to Paris and started to do a lot of his stuff in Paris, and from that point, he left a lot of his entourage in control of all of his businesses, as well as taking that money from Glazer and putting it against the mortgages of those properties. So people were skimming, they weren't paying taxes. These guys were not businessmen, and although he was a shrewd businessman when it comes to managing his fights and getting the most amount of money as he could, when he was away from America and in Paris, his businesses basically were just falling apart. So it was from this point that also there was rumours with him and Edna May and the fact that his businesses are falling apart. And at this point, obviously, the tax evasions coming in, the inland revenue is starting to pile down on Sugar Ray Robinson. And, you know, you're not earning much money, as Jim Norris said. So the only thing for him to do was to come back to boxing. In October 1954, Ray confirmed by saying, at first, he said, I have an urge to fight again, but I won't make any final decisions until I see how I make out in training. And he may have said that to the press, but deep down, he knew he had to return because he needed to earn that big dough again. So, obviously, he's out of the game. He's no longer the middleweight champion of the world. That is actually held by a certain guy called Bob Olsen, who was the middleweight champion at the time.
So, it's 1955 now, and eventually, he obviously has to return to the ring. And it's the pressures of the outside world, it's the pressures of life, predominantly from the IRS, which for us is HMRC, basically the tax man. So after a financial disagreement in December, after asking for more money, Ray decided to agree to fight ex-Marine Sergeant Joe Rendon, who was 36, 13 and 4. Now this was the second time he'd fought him already before, we talked about that earlier on, and this was on January the 5th at the Olympia Stadium in Detroit, and Ray returned to get a 6-round knockout. So 2 weeks later, Ray would have his next fight, and he would actually go on to lose it. For only the 4th time in his career, he took a loss, and it was to Ralph Tiger Jones in what was a very, very below par performance. Now, the Associated Press said he looked slow, his reflexes had gone, and he was hit too many times by Tiger. Sugar Ray didn't look too sweet after that either. He was bleeding from his nose and a cut over his right eye, and afterwards in the dressing room he said, I have no alibis, that's one I lost, let's get another fight. So Glazer was added as another manager, and he wasn't impressed with the tough choice of opponent after a 30-month layoff.
Yeah, he was, and this was again, I mean, Glazer being added to his entourage now, so there's another bit of money going out towards these guys. I mean, he's paying out all this money, he's lost his businesses, he's got the IRS on his back, so he just wants to keep fighting to make sure he can get some money. So he does take himself off to a 2-month training camp. And one thing Gainford did say as well, that although all those 2 years where he was dancing, the reason why he was getting hit so much is because he just didn't have his guard up. So he said he was using his feet, he wasn't using his hands, so that's why he got whipped. So, but either way, Gainford got him into shape, and after it got him in shape to fight another tough opponent in Johnny Lombardo, who pushed Ray the distance. And if it wasn't for a strong finish from Ray, he wouldn't have got the split decision, and it would have derailed the comeback further. So he got through one. He lost one, almost lost another, but that 2-week training camp obviously whipped him into shape, and he managed to get through the fight. So 3 more victories followed, only 1 knockout and 1 going the 10-round distance, with Ray beginning to show more stamina, more punching power. The last of the 3 was an elimination title shot for the middleweight crown. Ray said, I had reached the point where the IBC wanted to give me a shot at Bobo Olsen, who was the middleweight champion at the time, but first I had to earn it with a good win over a contender. we settled for a guy called Rocky Castellini, who was ranked as the #1 contender, and Ray was knocked down in the 6th round for a 9 count, but managed to outpoint Rocky to a split decision.
I thought he was a great fighter, a great fighter. I loved his combinations and his speed, the way he operated. I admired the way Sugar Ray Robinson threw his combinations. I have never seen, of all the champions I have viewed, I have never seen a champion quite as determined as he. I have never seen a fighter throw punches so short that does so much damage, the 6-inch punch. And till this day, I've never seen anyone like him.
So going back to the Associated Press here, and all the press officers that were speaking about Sugar Ray Robinson at the time, Oscar Frehley, who was coming early on in the conversation, said no champion has ever come out of retirement to win back a title. Yet boxing men, trainers, seconds and managers find Robinson an absorbing topic. Practically all of them believe that Sugar Ray can fight his way right back to the top. So Sugar Ray Robinson was honest about his new style that he'd adopted, admitting that he can't go into the ring and tap dance his way to victory anymore. Those days are over, and no one realises that better than I do. The spring I once possessed is gone, otherwise I think I have everything I had in my prime. That's why I'm certain I'll regain the middleweight title. So, at the age of 34, Sugar Ray Robinson knocked out Bobo Olsen in the 2nd round with a right-left combination that put Bobo flat on his back, and Ray had won the ring and lineal middleweight titles. Being the underdog must have made it even sweeter, of course, because he's now retained them titles after having this layoff, being at the age of 34 years of age, showing his class once more, even though it's quite obvious to ringside observers. He's slowing down, he's coming towards the end of his career now, he's not the champion he once was, but yet he still manages to come back and win the titles. And he actually broke down after this fight, overcome with emotion, because he'd been vindicated in the press so much. You were pointing it out a little bit earlier on that the press were getting to him a little bit more because he'd become a celebrity, not just a boxer, he was a celebrity at this point. So the press was scrutinising him, and this victory clearly meant so much more to him than just the titles.
Yeah, and also I believe that it showed a softer side, and the fans who didn't really like Ray Robinson, they didn't like it. Although he was a fantastic fighter, I don't think many liked him. He was a bit of a Marmite character, and I think because of he broke down, I think people actually just started to warm to him a little bit more. So, but he did end in 1955 with 7 fights, 6 wins, 1 loss, and 3 knockouts. So, moving into 1956, and the rematch with Bobo Olsen lasted just 2 more rounds. So Ray retained his ring and lineal middleweight titles 6 months later. So it was a right hand to the body that brought Olsen's guard down just long enough for Ray to whip in a left hook to the chin. Olsen went down to the canvas on his back again before rolling over a couple of times and attempted to get back on his feet, but the referee counted him out in the 4th round. So Ray also, after winning the title, he then goes on to retain it against Bobo again. So it was Ray's 90th knockout victory in 145 fights.
Wow.
And it was financially rewarding for both fighters. Each received nearly $90,000, although $85,000 of that $90,000 purse that he earned from winning that rematch was reclaimed by the Internal Revenue on Robinson's unpaid taxes, leaving the champ with no profits at all.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, I knew stories about Sugar Ray Robinson going broke at the end of his career and sad ending, but I didn't realise it was this bad, to be honest with you, about his career, and literally at points in this particular instance, he's fighting for nothing. Crazy, absolutely crazy. So
mate.
A few months after this now, the IBC matched Sugar Ray with Gene Fullmer, which was set for December the 12th at the Garden. In November, in New Haven, Connecticut, Ray outpointed Bob Provozzi in a 10-rounder to clock up some rounds in the bank before facing the rock-solid Fullmer, who was actually 11 years younger than Sugar Ray Robinson. But Sugar Ray, he's not bothered at this point. He doesn't give a shit about the age difference. And Sugar Ray Robinson said, "I've never heard of anyone winning a fight with a birth certificate." Brilliant. Great little quote there from Sugar Ray Robinson. So he ends 1956 with 2 fights, 2 wins and 1 knockout. And we move in to 1957 now. So Sugar Ray Robinson was to defend his middleweight titles against Gene Fullmer, who was 37-3 at this point, in December of 56, but the fight was postponed due to Ray picking up a fever. And of course, Sugar Ray Robinson honoured his contract with the promoter Jim Norris of the IBC and was set to defend the title on the rescheduled date of the 2nd of January 1957. So Gene was named after the heavyweight great Gene Tunney. He was the favourite going into the fight due to his age, rugged nature of the ring and power in both hands. So going into the fight, Sugar Ray Robinson got floored in the 7th, cut and soundly whacked to the body throughout before losing a unanimous decision.
Yeah, another defeat from Ray. Didn't quite work out against Gene Fullmer, who was a tough opponent. And after the fight, Ray said, "It wasn't my night. Fullmer got the 15-round decision, but at least I got $140,000 and the IRS agents let me keep it." So he managed to keep that money for that fight. Nice sum for Ray. And so, yeah, obviously the next thing was it was the return, and the return fight happened 4 months later in Chicago Stadium, and both fighters were paid $68,990. It was an even split by the IBC boss, Jim Norris. But of course, those men with the suits, or the Uncle Sam they like to call it, took $23,000 of Ray's earnings. So the second fight came about. It was a rematch. In the fight, again, Gene obviously is the favourite. Now, Ray was down on all 4 scorecards in that second fight. Now, he went back to his corner and he basically said, "I've had enough." But his corner convinced him to go out for another round. Now, I write the irony of it. Gene Fullmer actually said he felt quite comfortable in there. He felt like he was going to win another decision. He was just again into that 5th round. He was quite comfortable. And then Ray landed the perfect left hook on the retreat as well that knocked Fullmer out. It's an absolute stunning shot. You can check it out on YouTube. And it was the first and last time Fullmer had ever been knocked out in his career. It's one of the best one-punch finishes you'll ever see. And as I say, please check it out. It is on YouTube. It is a stunning, stunning finish. Robinson later called the blow the most perfect punch of my career. At the ripe age of 37, Ray was back on top of the world and the middleweight champion once again.
Wow, it's just crazy, isn't it? How every time he gets knocked down, he comes back against all odds and just manages to pull something out of the bag of tricks that he had. So we're carrying on his career here, and he makes another defence of the title against the current welterweight champion, who was Carmen Basilio, another fantastic name in the sport. Now, this was before the year was out. Basilio was a former Marine that had lost out on his first world title shot against Kid Gavilan, a former Sugar Ray Robinson opponent, as we spoke about earlier. Now, this was also on the end of a match fix against Johnny Saxton, who had ties with Mr. Blinky Polero and Funky Carbo, these 2 names popping up yet again. So Basilio was able to avenge that defeat twice by knockout before deciding to move up to middleweight to face Sugar Ray in what was a lucrative deal for him. Now, there was a little bit of animosity between them here because Basilio had been brushed off by the champ back in 1952 when he went over to shake his hand. 5 years later, and Basilio had the opportunity to teach him a lesson. And in his own words, Basilio said, "I'm going to fight that son of a bitch one day, and I'm going to kick his ass."
Yeah, he went one back on his words, old Basilio, and yeah, he was up for it. So Ray had actually added a theatrical, so he's going away from the fight slightly here, but he added a theatrical lawyer called Marty Machette to his ever-growing entourage, as we keep mentioning, and Marty had sorted the contract for the fight with the negotiations hitting stumbling blocks as usual, but the fight was finally agreed. It was Marty that actually pointed out to Ray that his entourage were making more money than he was. So he had Killer Johnson, who was added to his payroll 2 years earlier as one of the 3 managers alongside Gainford, Ernie Bracer and Joe Glazer. Now, Marty said, "You've got George and Killer splitting 33.5%, with Bracer and Glazer getting 10% each, which adds to just over 53%, or 53 1/3, I believe it is, percent, more than half your money. Add the money you give to Wiley and Gene Clark and everyone else around you, there's not much left for Sugar Ray Robinson." So not only has he got the IRS, when he's getting his purse, I mean, hardly, he's barely seeing any of this money. So his advice was to get rid of a few, particularly Bracer and Glazer, who were basically not doing much. Now, before the Basilio fight, Ray took Marty's advice, and he was actually later sued several months later, so this would have been after the Basilio fight, by Bracer for $18,000 and Glazer for $80,000 But because obviously he had given him extra money as well, Glazer. He actually was a friend, believe it or not. But, you know, he's giving him 130. He wants his money back. He's saying, give me 80. Ray's saying no. In the end, he foreclosed on his properties when Ray refused to pay him back. So Ray lost all of his properties as well. And at this point, I believe it was just not far. I think he still had his club. I think that's the only thing he had. But yeah, he was getting very skint.
It's crazy. This is, you know, turning into a tale which is becoming a little bit more sad as the years go by. So, after a very close seesaw fight, which could have gone either way, it was actually Basilio who got the nod and won by a split decision. Many ringside observers felt that Sugar Ray Robinson deserved to get the decision, but it was a brutal fight which took a lot from both men. The Ring magazine named it the fight of the year for 1957. So the Inland Revenue decided to come back again, come a knocking, and they basically took Ray's whole purse, which was about $500,000. They filed a notice of levy. So the men in suits served the notice on the IBC to hold all of Robinson's money and took the lot before Marty negotiated the release of $100,000 back to Ray. So with the federal government's continued pursuit of Sugar Ray Robinson, he had to try and find a loophole where he didn't lose as much money. So that ends 1957. 1957 ended with 3 fights, 1 win, 2 losses, and 1 knockout. So we move into 1958, and fortunately for Sugar Ray Robinson, manages to find that loophole for the rematch with Basilio. So he told Norris that he wouldn't fight unless he's got his money in cash, all 300,000 of it. So Norris did what he asked. He put all of the dollars into canvas sacks and he handed it over to Ray's lawyer, Marty Machette, who held onto it until Ray could collect. Because of how close the first fight was, a rematch had to be made. So many felt Ray was robbed and he deserved the opportunity to avenge his defeat. Basilio's eye blew up like a plum in the 6th round from a heavy punch. Basilio was unable to see, and his corner was contemplating pulling him out in the 14th. But Basilio was adamant he was finishing the fight. So this was another close fight, this second fight. Another great fight. 2 great fights. I mean, there's so many, isn't there? There's so many Sugar Ray Robinson fights that are just amazing. And the 2 Basilio fights were just fantastic. And this second one, just fantastic as well. And Ray would go on to win a split decision. So Basilio would see out the fight, Ray would get the split decision, and the fight was named the Ring magazine's Fight of the Year for 1958. Now, Nat Fleischer reported it didn't quite live up to the standards set in New York, but Sugar Ray showed why he is called a ring marvel by succeeding in doing what never before had been accomplished, winning the middleweight title for the 5th time.
Wow, and that would be his 5th and his final time. He wouldn't defend it for another 2 years, so he ended 1958 with just the 1 fight and the 1 win over Carmen Basilio. But, wow, I mean, he gets himself $300,000 in cash for it, though, which was a handy little move. I believe it was Marty that took the money. I think he stashed it in his under the bed he stayed at in a hotel as well. That's the story I heard. So he could make sure he kept it for Sugar Ray. But moving into 1959, in the summer of 59, Ray's marriage was on the rocks. His sister Marie died of cancer, which is tragic for him. It really affected him badly, and the NBA stripped him of his middleweight title because he refused to fight Basilio in the rubber match. Although he was still recognised as the New York State and the state of Massachusetts champ. So Boston promoter got involved because obviously now he's no longer at Madison Square Garden. Although he's recognised by New York, there was a reason why he couldn't fight in Madison Square Garden. But anyway, the Boston promoter Sam Silverman took over and he offered Ray $70,000 to defend his portion of the middleweight title against Paul Pender. Now the other portion of that was actually it was vacant and it went on with Gene Foreman and Carmen Basilio fought for it. So, and I think Foreman might have even won it, but I think it was actually. So to promote their fight, Silverman put on 2 headliners, Pender versus Gene Hamilton and Robinson against Bob Young at the Boston Garden, not the Madison Square Garden, which he would have wanted, because he loved the place, which Ray won by a knockout in the 7th round. So he ended 1959 with 1 win and 1 knockout as well.
Well, I'll tell you 3 things, Jack. The toughest fight I had out of the ring was when my mother found out that I was fighting.
Tell us about that. Come on now.
Well, you know, my name not being originally Robinson, my name really being Walter Smith, I changed my name, rather I borrowed a friend of mine's birth certificate, who was Ray Robinson, in order to obtain a boxing license. And when I become of age, I'd hope to give him his birth certificate back and his name. And I started fighting as an amateur under the name of Ray Robinson. And thanks to God, I was very successful in popularizing his name, and I had to keep it. And,
Is he using Smith today?
No. And for a long time, I sort of baffled my mother because of the different name. But one day, she looked in a paper and saw a picture of me, but it had Ray Robinson. And that's about the worst whipping I ever got. And I think the toughest fight I had up until the time I boxed Lamotta the last time was Fritz Zivic. But after that fight with Lamotta, if I tell anyone he wasn't the toughest man I've ever fought, they think I'm crazy.
So we're moving into 1960 here. 1960. It's ridiculous, isn't it? The amount of fights he's been in at this point. So we're moving into 1960. He's way past his best at this point, but he's still good enough to be competing with some of the best names out there at the moment. But in 1960, Paul Pender defeated Sugar Ray Robinson via unanimous decision. And it was scores of 147, 142, 146, 142, and 148, 142. But the Associated Press at ringside actually favoured Sugar Ray Robinson. So Ray had actually earned $120,000 for this particular fight. Now, 3 months before the rematch, Ray went on to have another fight against Tony Baldoni, which was a warm-up fight. But to be honest, it probably wasn't even worth the time because Ray would get in there and he'd knock him out in one round. So that warm-up fight wasn't really much of a warm-up. Now, the rematch itself was postponed, but it finally took place at the Boston Garden once again. And again, we're going back to the fact that he's not been able to fight at Madison Square Garden, which was his beloved home for where he boxed most of his career. And this time, he was beaten more convincingly than the first time in the rematch. And many felt this is going to be the last time we're going to see Sugar Ray Robinson in the ring. He's 39 years old at this point. 39 years old. But yet, he still made the decision to come back in the ring. Obviously, at this point, it's not all about the glory anymore. It's about the fact that he's got to continue to keep paying the IRS because they keep chasing him no matter where he goes.
It's crazy. I mean, it took $500,000 or 400 in the end, but they're still handing him for money. I mean, at the moment, it seems to be they've laid off of him, but crazy. So obviously, Paul Pender become the first fighter to ever beat Ray and then beat him in the rematch. How many times had Ray come through in rematches? And many people thought this was it. Ray Robinson managed to get himself another shot at the middleweight title. Now, this was the NBA title held by Gene Foreman, who had beat Carl Basile. I think he'd beaten him twice as well. So the NBA champ, had beaten Basile for the vacant title. So that portion that was obviously stripped from Ray in 1959 before repeating the feat again in 1960. So it was Ray's chance to win a world title in an unprecedented sixth time. But he would have to do so with a smaller cut of the purse. Basically, he got only 20% being the challenger and Foreman got 40%. Now, this was starting to get to the point now where Ray wasn't negotiating too much. He just needed the money. And it was another grueling 15-rounder. But many in attendance were pleasantly surprised to see Robinson of old, not the old-fashioned Robinson. With Foreman taking the 9th and the 10th, many felt that would have ended it there and Ray had no chance. And many obviously felt that it's just these last 5 rounds is just going to stop. But he came blistering back and had Foreman hurt in the 11th and finished the stronger. Something that the critics just couldn't believe that would ever happen. So the scores were at 11-4 to Ray, 9-5 to Foreman, and 8-8 even. And it was awarded a draw, and Foreman clung on to his title. Now, the variation of scorecards left many confused as far as the spectators and obviously the ringside reporters were concerned. And Ray had succeeded, although the record book suggests otherwise. Obviously, Ray, gutted by the results, was softened by the purse. So throughout, this is from Ray, so Ray says throughout the 15 rounds, he, as a Gene Foreman, had his right forearm protecting his jaw from that left hook, obviously worried about that devastating left hook that he landed in their last fight. I was disgusted with the decision, but my 20% came to a nice $50,000 for Sugar Ray. So he ended the 1960 with 1 win, 2 losses, and a draw with 1 knockout. This was the fight for me where I think he should have ended it. I think because it was a draw, it influenced his decision. He should be a 6-time world champion, but unfortunately, the variation in the judges' scorecards, and it didn't work out that way.
We move into 1961, just touching on the end of 1960, with 1 victory, 2 losses and a draw, with only 1 knockout. So, again, you can start to see the pattern here, like you was just saying, that his career should really have ended when it did, to be honest with you, at this point. But he comes back in 1961, 3 months after that last fight, with form of the 4th encounter was announced, this time in Sin City, Las Vegas, at the Convention Center. And, no pun intended, well, a lot of pun intended, the last throw of the dice for Sugar Ray Robinson here. The current score between them is 1 win apiece and a draw, so this was effectively the rubber match. The last time Ray was in Vegas, he was dancing and collecting $25,000 for doing so as well. But this time, he's fighting and he's looking to earn $100,000 for just 45 minutes work. Now, following a dispute with the size of the ring, Sugar Ray Robinson threatened to withdraw from the fight because he didn't want the fight against the bullneck former in a telephone booth. So he didn't want the advantages to be in Former's favour, basically. But it was yet another tough and close fight with Ray, this time going for the knockout in the first 2 rounds before Former came back. Now, Ray took the last 2, but it wasn't enough, as Former ended up winning this 4th encounter by unanimous decision.
So he lost again to Former. Now, it really should be calling it a day. But 6 months on from the 4th and final fight with Former, Ray found himself back in the ring against the middleweight champion of Canada, a guy called Wilfie Greaves, at the new convention centre in his native city of Detroit, where he originally came, obviously, when we were talking about Walker Jr. Ray went down in the 8th round, but he survived. The bell saved him, basically. He actually went on, before going on to actually win a dubious split decision. They fought again in Pittsburgh 3 months later, and Ray sent the home fans happy that night after catching Greaves with his trademark left hook in the 8th round. So he felt that he was back, and he said himself, he says, I'm back shooting for the middleweight championship again.
While training for his next fight, which was only 1 month later, against Denny Moyer, he's now 40 years old as well at this point, way past his best. But ironically, he's still better than most that are around, which is crazy. So, we're talking about the elite fighters of the division, like your Fulmers, and then you've got Sugar Ray Robinson, who's obviously past his best, sort of just below them, but still better than most that were around at this point. So he actually went on to outpoint the 22-year-old Moyer over 10 action-packed rounds in front of 7,800 spectators back in his beloved Madison Square Gardens. So 18 years his junior, he goes and beats the 22-year-old Moyer, and they decide that they want to fight again. They meet again in February 1962, and this turned out to be Sugar Ray Robinson's last appearance at Madison Square Gardens, and unfortunately for Sugar Ray, he actually lost in a loop-sided decision in front of only 1,860 fans. Now, this was at the Providence Auditorium in Rhode Island. Ray knocked out Al Hauser in the 6th round, and the weather kept the fans away, as it was as bad as what the opponent was.
Yeah, Hauser was 7 wins, 5 losses and 3 draws, so it was a pretty poor opponent after that defeat in his last appearance at Madison Square Garden. He ended 1961 with 5 fights, 4 wins, 2 knockouts and 1 defeat. So he still continued 1962 after defeating Denny Moyer at the Garden. Ray knocked out Bobby Lee in 2 rounds before fighting Denny's brother Phil Moyer in Los Angeles. And at a ripe age of 41 years old, Ray lost a split decision, but he would continue again. And Ray even said, my income tax debt to Uncle Sam makes it necessary for me to continue in the ring. I'll go back to England to fight Terry Dans after my broken bone in my hand mends. So a little over 2 months later, Ray was true to his word. Last time he was in London, he was beaten by Randy Turpin. This time, he was up against Cockney Terry Dans, who was 29-8 and 2, 24 knockouts. And he actually beat Ray on points. He beat the aged former champion, although he almost lost it in the last round. It was actually quite funny. So Terry Dans was winning the fight quite comfortably, and in the end, he started to trade with Ray because Ray went for it in the last round. He had Dans in all sorts of trouble, but the Londoners survived the scare at the Empire Port Wembley. So yeah, he's still fighting, but I'm not quite sure why. By this point, Edna May had become tired of the physical abuse, which is something that we won't go into too much into detail about, but it was, as I say, handled with his with a wife, as his sons witnessed this, plus his constant cheating and his ongoing affair with a California woman who was Minnie Bruce, who actually ended up becoming his wife later on. They've been separated for the best part of a year. So it's no surprise when a Mexican divorce papers came through. Not quite sure why it was that. By this point, Ray had sold the Flamingo Continental, his lovely car he adored. His cafe was closed, and Ray said himself, the symbol of my success had disappeared.
It's getting even more of a sad affair, really. Like, we're looking at his career in the ring, and he's starting to lose fights left, right, and centre at this point. He's nowhere near anything like he was at one point in his career, like we've spoken about throughout this episode. You can start to see the pattern of how things inside and outside of the ring are starting to take a bit of a nasty turn for him, really. So at this point, Ray's trying to recover the money that he was owed for the first Basilio fight way back in 1957. But somehow during a mess, Ray received a check for $123,935.65 from the IRS. Now, Ray cashed in the check as fast as he could, leaving the bank with bags full of dollar bills. So going back to the end of his marriage with Edna May, once the divorce had gone through and Ray had got engaged to Millie Bruce in Vienna, he celebrated by going and knocking out a Spaniard by the name of Diego Infantes in 2 rounds to become his 96th knockout in 148 victories. And his next stop was the Palais des Sports in Lyon in France, where he decided to go to and stop George Estafov in the 6 in front of 7,000 spectators, and he would end 1962 with 6 fights, 3 wins, all by way of knockout, and 3 losses on his career record at this point.
So yeah, moving into 1963, and in January at the Miami Beach Convention Center, Ray appointed Ralph Dupas in front of only 5,500 fans, which is starting to get a trend now with Sugar Ray, where even the attendances are starting to drop. And following that victory, he then went on to get 3 knockout victories over Bernie Reynolds, Billy Thornton, and Morris Rubnet over the next 4 months, which set up another opportunity for a title shot, believe it or not, which is incredible, really. That he was obviously really wanted that title shot, and he looked like he's finally going to get it. So he had to get past a really tough opponent in Joey Gardello, who was 90, 23, and 8 in his hometown of Philadelphia. So it was a real chance for him, a contender. He had to get past him. If he gets past Gardello, he will have a title shot.
It was in front of a capacity crowd of 8,598. It filled the convention hall, and what they witnessed was actually one of the worst beatings Sugar Ray Robinson had ever taken in his long, illustrious career. And after the fight, Ray had actually said he was very seriously considering retirement. But once again, the good old IRS took his entire purse for the bout, which was an estimated $14,500, and Ray basically said, for reasons I don't know. Ray was still seeking that significant victory, so he went back to Paris after Charlie Michaelis booked him for 5 fights. Now, Ray didn't lose any of those in 2 months, and he fought Armand Vanucci, outpointing him twice, Fabio Bettini, which was a draw, and Emile Serenz in an 8th round knockout, and then finally Andre Devere on points. So he got all them fights, he got them 5 fights. He wanted to get himself back into the contention, and again we're looking back on a career of a guy who'd been going for quite a significant period of time now, way past his best. I've said this on numerous occasions over the past 15-20 minutes of the podcast, because you're thinking to yourself, why is this guy still going on? Why did he go on so long in his career? But again, it's the IRS taking all his purses, and the sad story of it. So he ended 1963 with 10 fights, 8 wins, 1 loss and 1 draw, 4 coming by way of knockout, and we move into 1964.
Yeah, so 1964 still continues, and after that point in Gaylord Barnes in May, Ray... Gaylord Barnes in May, and Ray knocked out Clarence Riley as well. And this was an interesting one, because Clarence Riley, he knocked this guy out who wasn't really anything, and he beat him in front of 1,500 spectators, and he earned $700 at a ballpark in Pittsburgh, Massachusetts. So it just shows you this is the point, surely now, where it's beginning to it's very near the end, and even the morning papers didn't print a single word of the fight either after. And so 2 weeks later, he was in Nebraska, and Sugar Ray fought to a draw with an unknown Art Hernandez in front of 3,593 fans. After the fight, Robinson said, at 43, I'm trying to get another shot at the championship. this ain't fair. Because of the draw, he still felt that it was a bad decision and he deserved to win the fight. But 43, all you're getting now, I'm guessing at the time, is guys that just won't go and see Sugar Ray Robinson, and because he was just still fighting. But yeah, it just seemed like it was just inevitable that surely he's just going to come to an end. But no, it continued.
It's crazy. So in September of 1964, he actually comes back to the UK, to Britain, but this time he goes to Scotland against the British champion Mick Lear, who was 52-14, who ended up beating Sugar Ray Robinson on points. So yet again, he's losing more fights. He's fighting for pittance as well at this point in a lot of his fights, and he moves on and he agrees to fight a Frenchman by the name of Yolande Levesque, and this was at the end of September in Paris. So he was poor yet again, and the 5,000 fans that were in attendance actually booed at their disapproval of the questionable win for Ray Robinson. So he basically looked shit in this particular fight. By all reports, he looked shit in the fight, but yet somehow still managed to get a decision in front of the French fans, who of course were going to support their man, which was Levesque. Of course they were. They're not going to support Ray Robinson. They're going to look at this guy as an old washed up fighter, way past his best, who's, because of his name's probably got the decision. So Ray then goes back to London. He finally won in London. He got a 6-round stoppage of Johnny Angel in London, and he finished the year in France and Italy recording wins over Jackie Callaloo, a former welterweight champion, in Jean-Baptiste Roland in front of 5,000 fans, and Jean Beltrite. All victories were by decision before he drew with Bettini in Rome. For 1964, he ends it with 10 fights, 7 wins, but only 2 knockouts, 2 draws and a defeat. So he's, as you can see, the pattern and the trend is getting ever so more the same really over the last couple of years that we've covered off. The last 2 to 3 years, he has 9-10 fights. He wins, say, 60% of them, maybe loses 1 or 2, gets a couple of draws. You're thinking to yourself, why does he retire? Why does someone not just getting retired? But we know there's too many people around that can capitalise from the Sugar Ray Robinson name. So we move into 1965.
Yeah, so in 1965 we come across an interesting story, which I think many will like. It was during a snowy winter in New York. Sugar Ray decided to take a fight in Kingston, Jamaica, against a guy called Jimmy Beecham. Now, in Ray's corner, as a second, was the new heavyweight champion of the world, going by the name of a certain Muhammad Ali. Now, he actually had just beaten Sonny Liston. He was obviously Cassius Clay, and he had just changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, he was a massive fan of Sugar Ray. So Ray had been keeping an eye on Cassius Clay since that one moment they had sort of way back a few years before. And Ray, obviously, as Ray met him in the summer of 1960, and he was obviously telling Ray that he's gonna bring back the gold medal, and when he turns pro, he wants Ray to be his manager. So in a stunt for more attention for the fight that was coming up against Jimmy Beecham, Ray's promoter told Ray to get Ali involved, and he did. And he actually phoned him up and said to him, "Would you want to come and be my second? If I give you $1,000, you come on a plane with me to Jamaica." And he was on the plane straight away, and Ray won the fight by a 2nd-round knockout. And interestingly enough, considering all of his problems he was having at the time, after the fight, Muhammad Ali told Ray that Elijah Muhammad had said that he would give Robinson $700,000 if he would embrace the Muslim faith, but Ray respectively declined.
Wow. Well, there's a story I never knew about that, and I'd heard stories about Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali's relationship, but I never knew this story of Ali going in and helping him as a second in the corner, and then also obviously the conversion to Islam, and obviously the Nation of Islam as it was at the time, led by Elijah Muhammad. There's a lot of speculation about the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad and the doings and all the documentaries that are out there. So he was basically offering a hell of a lot of money to basically get a superstar. Well, I wouldn't call him a superstar at this point, Sugar Ray Robinson. I'd call him what he was, which is a way past his best fighter, but he was well known. So he basically wanted to get someone like Sugar Ray Robinson on his books, maybe to bring more attention to the Nation of Islam. I don't know, but $700,000 would certainly get rid of a few problems for Sugar Ray Robinson. But the guy had morals. The guy respectfully declined that offer, and he had morals to do so. So he moves on from that moment, and in his next 2 fights, he knocked out Earl Bastings in Georgia and Rocky Randall in Virginia, before losing a controversial decision against Mexican Memo Ayun in Tijuana in May. So Another story then. During the long drive to Los Angeles, Sugar Ray Robinson and Millie took a detour to Las Vegas, where they tied the knot on the 25th of May 1965. Now, their honeymoon in Honolulu had to take a back seat, though, because Ray had agreed to fight Stan Harrington. So, just got married, going to Honolulu, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to take this fight. He fights Stan Harrington and actually loses on a unanimous decision. And then, after another split decision defeat to Ferd Hernandez in Las Vegas, Ray returned to Honolulu to try and avenge his defeat against Harrington, but yet again lost by decision. So this story tells me that he gets married, and instead of going on a proper honeymoon, he thinks, you know what am I going to do on my wedding night? Well, I'm going to go and fight a guy instead and try and earn some money, but ends up losing, and then ends up losing a further 2 times on the back of that.
That's just a terrible move, really. I think I did read that he spent much of the time with sunglasses on as well, because he had a massive shiner as well. So I bet that didn't go down too well with Billy. But I mean, that's Ray all over. Just always wants to earn himself a little bit more money. But Ray did win a trio of fights against journeymen, or a journeyman, I should say, in Harvey McCulloch, and somehow, from winning those against a guy, I mean, he was pretty much very much a journeyman, he managed to finally get an opportunity to challenge a top middleweight contender in Joey Archer, who was 44-1 at the time. And at the age of 44 years old, surely was his last chance to lose. Now, this is the fight where if he beat Joey Archer at the age of 44 years old, he will get a title shot. And Ray earned around $5,000 for the fight at the Civic Center in Pittsburgh. Well, let's just say it didn't quite work out for Ray. Unfortunately, he was floored for the 9 count in the 4th round, but had a good 6. All in all, it was a decent fight, but Archer was the aggressor throughout, and many people say Archer couldn't even knock out. He couldn't fight his way through a wet paper bag, basically. He was no banger. So for Ray to get put down is a bit of a problem, and the 3 officials scored the fight 49-40, 50-39, and 48-41, all in favour of Joey Archer, and that was pretty much how it ended for Ray. That was his last fight.
Now we've got a few quotes from a few different people in the side of the journalism world about Sugar Ray Robinson. So this is by Martin Kane for Sports Illustrated. It had been a long and glorious trail for Sugar Ray Robinson, who just may have been the best fighter ever. His skills were exquisite, his punch superb, his courage unsurpassed. But as he has just learned, there will always come a day when only the courage remains. New York writer and columnist Pete Hamill recalled at Ray's finale fight, a few seats away from me was Miles Davis, the great trumpet player who used to work out with Robinson at Harry Wiley's gym in Harlem. Miles is a tough, laconic man, but as he rose, looking into the ring at his stricken friend, tears moved down his cheek. Later, we were all in the dressing room and Robinson looked tired and old. He had lost a 10-round decision. His left hand was jammed in an ice bucket and Miles started whispering in his deep croaking voice that it was over, that it was time to pack it in, and Robinson just nodded in agreement.
Well, obviously people at ringside and people that love Ray clearly see that this is just taking its toll, and finally Robinson agreed, and there were many people that were saying to him that this has to be your last fight, and even Ray said after, he said, I want to get a night's sleep before I make up my mind. But then next afternoon at the airport, waiting for a plane to take him back to New York, Sugar Ray smiled, hunched his black leather hip-length coat over his shoulders and said that retirement was the only course open to him now. But there was a gentleman that one of the followers or protested that, but we have an offer for a return bout with Archer. And then Sugar Ray just said, what's the point? And that was it. Robinson, from that point, I don't think he actually made a public statement. He just sort of disappeared, really. In the end, I think it was later on, a few months later, he openly said, I won't be coming back to the ring. And he did have a conversation with Millie as well, and he told her after the fight that it's not happening, and she was really happy about it. And I believe George Gainford was there sort of saying, come on, we'll have Joey Archer one more time. And even Sugar Ray said, look, George, it's over, it's finished. So, at 44, he finally, after that one last chance, I think he realised that he ain't going to get that middleweight title again, and he called it a day.
So, just a month after the Archer fight, Ray went back to Madison Square Garden in the centre of the ring, but this time it was thankfully not to participate in a fight. He'd obviously done enough fighting throughout his career, as we know, in front of a crowd of 12,146 people. They all gave him a standing ovation when he entered the ring. Randy Turpin, Bobo Olsen, Gene Former, and Carmen Basilio all gathered under the ring spotlights once more, just to show how much admiration they had for Sugar Ray Robinson, and all the iconic battles that they'd all participated in were the greatest fighter that had ever lived. Sugar Ray Robinson, it was presented with a big gold trophy which was inscribed the world's greatest fighter, and that brought an end to his career. In 1965 he had 14 fights, 8 victories, 5 losses and 1 no contest, and he won 4 of knockouts in 8 fights. So we move in to the aftermath of his career now, and what life was like for him after boxing.
Sugar Ray, I mean, the one story is that when Sugar Ray returned to his $365 a month apartment overlooking the Hudson River, he had nowhere to put this massive gold trophy he had just picked up, saying the world's greatest fighter. The only furniture he had was a cards table and a bed, plus a balcony with a view. And he told biographer Dave Anderson, I think he wrote the book, Sugar Ray. He was like a shallow writer, but Sugar Ray said, I not only had no money, I had no way of making any. I had to borrow. I got a few thousand from Vincent Impratelli, who was the mayor, who had actually handed over the trophy to him as well in the ring that night, who had become a judge. I got a few more thousand from some friends. My ego had trapped me. So he was in a position where he didn't have much money. He was just borrowing money from friends, a few thousand here, a few thousand there. He said every now and then a check would come through. And that was how he lived his life, for pretty much the rest of his life. I mean, the one other story, which is quite interesting, is that Frank Sinatra, actually, they had struck up such a good friendship that Frank Sinatra apparently arranged for a fee to be sent every month to Sugar Ray Robinson because he knew he never had no money. So
Wow.
That just shows you, even Frank Sinatra was chipping in to make sure that he earned himself a few bob. Yeah, it's such a sad ending, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a sad ending, and obviously he was trying to make money where he could, so he decided to try and produce another album like he did in the early 60s. He also picked up a little bit of money acting in several television dramas, including Mission Impossible, an episode of Land of the Giants called Giants and All That Jazz. We also even got to the point, very much like Joe Louis in his life as well, where he ends up sort of going and being a bit of a feature at certain places, and Sugar goes and starts opening up all these places, and then there's a point where he goes into certain episodes on the telly, and it's just crazy. It's just crazy to think, like, he had everything on a plate. He had the world at his feet and the world eating out the palm of his hands at one point, and then for him to having to go into TV series and do things that naturally wasn't probably what he ideally wanted to go into, but felt like he had some sort of talent to try and make a bit of money into, and that's what he had to do. And it was crazy, absolutely crazy, that you sort of see someone so good as a fighter get reduced to something sort of so small as we was talking about. So ironically enough, Robinson then was elected to the Ring Magazine Boxing Hall of Fame in 1967, which was 2 years after he's retired, and he also went into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. In 1969, he founded the Sugar Ray Robinson Youth Foundation for the inner city of Los Angeles area, and we go to the sad ending of the episode, where in Robinson's last and final years of his life, he got diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He ended up passing away in Los Angeles on the 12th of April 1989 at only 67 years old. His body was buried at Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California. So it was quite a sad ending, really, when you think about his life and you think about the average life expectancy these days. That he ended up passing away at the age of 67, 1989. He passed away at the age of 67, and I think maybe, suffering Alzheimer's disease, could it have been a factor of him being in the ring, getting punched in the head too long? Could that have caused this issue? We're never going to really know, but it was such a sad way to see him go out, as he was such once a feared fighter, and a fighter that nobody would share the ring with, a fighter that he couldn't find the competition because he was too good, but yet it was just such a sad way for him to go out.
It really was, and obviously the certain Muhammad Ali went the same route. Obviously he lived a little bit with Alzheimer's, but many people really, at the time, no one really knew what Alzheimer's was, and many people said that he was almost like he was smoking weed or something, because he was just always looked stoned out of his nut, where he just wasn't responding too well. And obviously that was the Alzheimer's. One of his last public appearances was actually in 1986 as the best man to the groom of Jake LaMotta, which was, and then 3 years later, on the 12th of April, he actually, at 67, that was when he died. So it's interesting that was one of his last public appearances, was against, obviously, the great Jake Lamotta as well. And yeah, I mean, it's so sad. I mean, 202 fights in total, 175 wins, 108 knockouts. I mean, that's just incredible. Only 19 losses as well. And we clearly went through the last end of his career there, and a lot of those losses were literally because he was fighting on for too long. But 6 draws and 2 no contests. So, I mean, what an incredible career of Sugar Ray. It really is amazing. And there was one quote I found from, it was the Garden's boxing director, Harry Markson, who told the New York Post columnist, Milton Gross, his quote was, during the height of his career, Sugar Ray didn't lack a single attribute which the great fighters need. He had a left hook, a right cross, defensive skills, a will to win, ring generalship, speed of hand and foot, courage, a sense of pacing, a variety of punches, the ability to size up his opponent after a round or two, split-second reflexes, magnificent legs, and the ability to reach superior heights when the situation required it. And do you know what? That sums up Sugar Ray to me. Sugar Ray Robinson basically had it all.
He certainly did. He's one of my favourite fighters. I mean, we never got to live through this guy's era, of course. You know, we were born in the 80s, so we never got to see how good of a fighter he is. And obviously, it's thanks to the wonders of the internet that we get to see all this. And it's thanks to, obviously, all the books and the documentaries that have been created over the years where we're able to source a lot of the material from to put together this episode. And this episode has been the longest ever episode that we've done in the history of the whole podcast. And rightly so, because it was such a man that needed such an episode. And it's the development of the Career Profiles podcast, of course. You know, we try to give you as much information as possible, as many stories that you may or may not have heard before, something different for people to listen to. So the Sugar Ray Robinson episode is one that has been absolutely amazing to cover. Some stories that I've never even heard about, that has blew my mind throughout doing this podcast. And I hope that everybody that listens to it, I know you'll have stuck with it for nearly 3 hours, but of course, hopefully that is 3 hours that you will have really enjoyed listening to some things about Sugar Ray Robinson that you probably wouldn't have even known about, the stories about him, the way his career went, the way it went to a high and then went down to a low. And I hope that everybody really, really enjoys listening back to this episode on the career profile of Sugar Ray Robinson. And of course, if you have, then please do let us know if you have, because you can go and find us on Twitter at career_profiles and tweet us and let us know what you really thought of this episode. If you think there's anything we missed, if you didn't really enjoy it, if you think there's anything we could have done different, then of course give us that feedback, because that's the only way we'll ever be able to make this podcast into something more than what it is at the moment. So please do that. And if you've not already rated and reviewed the Career Profiles podcast, then please go and do that on Apple Podcasts, because it really, really does help put this podcast out there to more listeners, so more listeners get to hear the career profile of guys like Sugar Ray Robinson. We've also got career profiles on Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, Muhammad Ali, Joe Calzaghe, Michael Spinks. There's plenty of them out there to listen to. We've done some of the greatest fighters, and there's so many more to come. So thank you so much for sticking with us. I hope you've really enjoyed this episode with the career profile of the greatest fighter, Sugar Ray Robinson.